Beatrice Crow didn't even lower her voice when she said it. She was standing at the general store counter, surrounded by half a dozen women who'd come in to escape the gray morning cold. And she said it loud enough that Elsie Hartwell, standing not 12 feet away with a basket over her arm, heard every word. You know what I saw her doing this morning? Down by the creek again, on her hands and knees in the mud, pulling up weeds. Beatrice set her coin purse on the counter with a little click. Jonah works himself half to death in those fields. His wife spends her mornings playing in the dirt like a child. She smiled at the women around her, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost the laughter that followed wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. Elsie stood very still. She had heard variations of this her entire life, and she had learned slowly, painfully, that responding only gave people more to talk about. Picked up the flowers she'd come for, turned, and walked out of the store without a word, but was tight the whole way home. If you've ever been the person everyone dismisses, if you've ever known something true that no one around you could see yet, then you know exactly what that walk felt like. You know what it costs to keep going anyway. This is the story of Elsie Hartwell. And before it's over, Ash Creek will know her name in a way Beatrice Crow never imagined. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single. We put out new ones every week, and some of them will stay with you long after you've finished watching. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment with your city or country. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Ash Creek was not a cruel place by nature. It was simply a hard one, settled 20 years earlier by families who'd come west with more hope than supplies. It had grown into a rough grid of farmsteads and dirt roads, held together by necessity and habit. The winters were bitter. The summers were dry. The creek that gave the settlement its name ran well in spring and slowed to a thin trickle by August, and the farmers who worked the surrounding land understood, in a way that people from gentler places might not, that the difference between a good year and a ruined one could come down to a single week of weather. In a place like that, you didn't have much patience for things you didn't understand. Elsie Hartwell was something Ash Creek didn't understand. She was 26, which was young enough that people still occasionally referred to her as that Hartwell girl, despite the fact that she'd been married 3 years and ran her own household. She was heavyset in a way that frontier women rarely had the luxury of, being most of them burned off every ounce through sheer labor, and she had a habit of going quiet in company that people often misread as slowness. She wasn't slow. She was watching. She had always been watching. Her husband Jonah was a different kind of person entirely. He was lean and sunburned and relentlessly social, the kind of man who knew everyone's name and could spend an hour talking about weather or seed costs without it feeling like small talk. He was also genuinely kind, which is rarer than people acknowledge, and he loved Elsie in the way that good men love complicated women, with a combination of deep loyalty and low-grade bewilderment that never quite resolved. He worried about her. Specifically, he worried about what people said about her. You know, Beatrice was at the Henderson supper last night, he told her one evening. He was at the table with his boots off, rubbing the side of his foot the way he did when something was bothering him. Mrs. Henderson told me Beatrice said you'd been down at the creek again that morning. Said she didn't know how you had time for it, with the house to manage. Elsie was standing at the stove. She didn't turn around. I was there for 2 hours. The house was fine, I know that. Then why are you telling me what Beatrice said? Jonah was quiet for a moment. Because people listened to Beatrice. Elsie ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of him. People listened to the man who said the eastern fields were too rocky to plant. We planted them anyway. The potatoes did fine. That's not the same thing. Why not? He picked up his spoon and didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. This was the shape of their marriage in those years, not unhappy, not broken, but bent at a particular angle around the question of what Elsie did with her mornings, and what it cost both of them in the currency of other people's opinions. Jonah was a man who needed to be respected by his community. He had built his entire sense of himself on that foundation. And his wife was a woman who went out before dawn to crouch in creek mud and come home with her apron full of plants that no one else thought were worth anything. It was from the outside easy to understand why people talked. What nobody outside that household understood was what Elsie was actually doing. She had started it when she was 14, living with her grandmother in a part of the country where proper gardens were a luxury, and hunger was a neighbor that came and went without warning. Her grandmother had been a compact, weathered woman who spoke little and observed everything, And she had taught Elsie that the land in front of you is rarely empty, even when it looks it. You just had to learn to see what was there. Elsie had taken that lesson and spent the next 12 years building on it. She read every agricultural pamphlet she could get her hands on. She corresponded briefly with a botanist in the East until his letters stopped coming. Kept a journal, 3 of them now, filled with pressed plant samples and observations, written in her cramped, careful hand documenting what grew where, in what season, under what conditions. She noted which plants survived drought and which drowned in wet years. She noted which ones the insects left alone, and which ones drew every aphid and beetle in the county. Tasted things carefully in small amounts, watching her own body's responses over hours and days. She was not doing this because she expected disaster. She was doing it because her grandmother had told her once that the land always knows something you don't, and the only respectful thing to do is pay attention. The journal she was keeping the fall the beetles came was her 4th. The morning the swarm arrived, Elsie was already at the creek. She noticed the sky before she noticed anything else, a particular quality to the light, a yellowish flatness that she had noted before in her journals, but never been able to fully explain. The air was very still, not the comfortable stillness of an early morning before the wind came up, but something suspended, like the moment between a man drawing breath and beginning to shout. She was kneeling at the edge of the creek bank, her fingers in the mud around a patch of watercress, when she heard it. Started as a sound she couldn't identify, a low, dry hiss, like rain falling on paper, but coming from the wrong direction, from the east, from a sky that was perfectly clear. She stood up and looked, and the horizon had gone dark. Not cloud dark, not storm dark. Something else, something that moved in the way that weather doesn't, in the way that living things do, shifting and contracting and expanding, a darkness that had direction and intention. She knew what it was before it arrived. She grabbed her basket and ran. She was back at the house and inside with the door shut by the time the first beetles hit the outer wall, a sound like gravel thrown against wood, thousands of small bodies landing at once, and then the hiss became a roar. Continuous crackling that was everywhere, overhead and on all sides, filling the air until it was hard to think through it. Stood at the window and watched the crops disappear. That was the only word for it that she ever used afterward, in her journal and in conversation, and in the speech she eventually gave to the County Agricultural Society years later. Disappear. She watched the garden vanish. She watched the rows of cabbages and beans and potatoes that she and Jonah had planted in April and tended through the dry summer become something else, devoured, stripped, reduced to stems and stalks in less time than it took to make a pot of coffee. Pressed her hand flat against the cold window glass. She was not thinking in that moment about being right. She was not thinking about Beatrice Crow or the women at the general store or her husband's worried face at the supper table. She was thinking about food, about the coming winter, about how many families in Ash Creek were standing at their own windows, right now, watching the same thing happen to everything they'd grown. She was also thinking about what was still out there. Jonah came back from the fields when the swarm finally passed, which was late afternoon. He walked in through the kitchen door and stood there for a moment, and Elsie looked at him and understood immediately that it was bad. He was not a man who showed things easily on his face, but he had been outside in it, had watched it happen up close, and he hadn't come home with anything in his hands. How bad, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He sat down at the table, just sat down without taking his coat off, without pulling his boots off at the door the way he usually did. Cabbages, the beans, the potato tops are gone. Might be able to salvage some of the root if the ground doesn't freeze too fast. But he stopped, looked at the tabletop. The Pikes lost everything. Henderson, too. I walked past the Crow place on the way back. Their garden looks like someone plowed it under. Elsie put the kettle on. We're not going to make it to spring, Jonah said. Not to her specifically. More to the room, not on what's left. We might, Elsie said. He looked at her. There's more than what we planted, she said carefully, because she had learned to be careful with him on this subject, to not say too much too fast in a way that made him feel lectured or corrected. I've been tracking it for years, Jonah. What grows along the creek? What grows in the waste ground? What grows in the fence rows? Some of it is more than we'd need just for us. He stared at her. You mean the weeds? She kept her voice even. I mean the lamb's quarters, and the purslane, and the watercress, and the nettles, and the wild onions that have been growing in the same places along that creek since before either of us got here. She paused. They don't look like much. They're not much, individually. But I know where all of them are, and I know which ones are safe, and I know how to prepare them. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. People will say, people's crops are gone, Elsie said. What people will say is going to matter less than it did this morning. He looked at her for another moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read, not quite belief, not quite doubt, something in between that she had seen there before and had learned to work with. All right, he said finally, show me. The next morning, Elsie took Jonah to the creek. She showed him the lamb's quarters first, because they were the most plentiful and the easiest to see broad-leafed plants with a slight silvery coating on the underside, growing in dense clusters along the shaded bank. She showed him how to identify them, how to distinguish them from plants that looked similar but weren't, how to harvest the tender top growth in a way that let the plant recover and produce again. She showed him the purslane in the waste ground behind the fence line, succulent and low, full of water even in dry conditions. She showed him where the watercress grew in the shallow edges of the creek itself, and she explained that it needed to be washed carefully before eating, because of what else lived in the water. She showed him the nettles and laughed a little when he reached for one too quickly and pulled his hand back. Don't grab. Roll your fingers under and lift from the bottom. The sting is in the surface hairs, and they collapse when you press against the stem from below. She demonstrated. Once they're cooked, the sting is completely gone. They taste like spinach almost. Almost, he repeated. Almost like spinach. She showed him the wild onions, which he did actually recognize he'd grown up with them, he said, though he'd never thought of them as anything but a nuisance. She showed him dried cattail roots and how they could be ground into flour if you were patient about it. She showed him the rose ships that still clung to the wild rose canes along the north fence, shriveled but still viable, still packed with nutrition. And she showed him finally the 4 journals. He sat on a log at the creek's edge and flipped through them slowly. He wasn't a man who read easily. He'd had maybe 2 years of actual schooling, but he could follow the drawings well enough. The careful illustrations she'd made of each plant along with notes about season and location and use. Turned the pages slowly. Stopped at one. Turned back and stopped at another. You did all of this, he said, over 4 years. He was quiet for a while. The creek moved past them. A bird called somewhere in the brush on the opposite bank. Thought you were just... He stopped. I know what you thought. Closed the journal and held it in his hands. I'm sorry, Elsie. She looked at him. She had expected a lot of things from this conversation. That particular sentence wasn't among them. I should have asked, he said. Instead of just worrying about what people thought, I should have asked what you were actually doing out here. Took the journal back from him carefully and tucked it under her arm. Well, she said, now you know. They walked back toward the house, and for the first time in a long while, they walked side by side rather than one of them slightly behind the other. The first person who came to Elsie's door was Hannah Pike. Elsie had expected someone to come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to be Hannah, and she hadn't expected it to be so soon, barely 2 days after the swarm, while the ground was still covered in the dry shells of dead beetles, and the stripped garden rows looked like something out of a bad dream. Hannah was 32, with 4 children ranging from 6 to 13, and a husband who had a good heart but no idea what to do with a crisis. She arrived at Elsie's door in the early morning, with the youngest child on her hip and a look on her face that Elsie's recognized immediately, not quite desperation, but the thing that comes just before it. The moment when a person realizes they've run out of options they understand and have to try something they don't. I heard, Hannah said, without any preamble, that you might. She stopped, shifted the child to her other hip. Someone said you might know what to do about food. Elsie looked at her for a moment. Hannah had been in the group at the general store. Elsie didn't think she'd laughed, exactly, but she hadn't spoken up either. Come in, Elsie said. Bring the little one. She sat Hannah at the kitchen table and put tea in front of her and got out the journals. She didn't make a speech. She didn't say anything about the creek, or about what she'd been doing all those mornings, or about what people had said. She just opened the book to the first pages and started explaining. Hannah was a quick listener. She leaned forward over the table, her elbows on the wood, pulling the journal closer to get a better look at the drawings. She asked good questions, careful ones, the kind that showed she was actually thinking about what Elsie was telling her, and not just waiting for the talking to be over. And the children can eat all of these, she asked, pointing at the lamb's quarters illustration. All of them. I'd have them watch me harvest it a few times first, so they know what they're looking for. What about the nettles? Mine are curious. They'll touch everything. Show them the right way to handle them, before you take them anywhere near a patch. Make it something they know how to do rather than something they have to be kept away from. Elsie paused. Children learn better when you show them what's possible instead of what's dangerous. Hannah looked at her over the journal. That's true, she said quietly, in a way that suggested she was thinking about something beyond plants. By the end of the morning, Hannah's oldest, a 13-year-old girl named Rosie, with her mother's quicks, had been sent home to get her brothers, and Elsie took the whole family down to the creek. She showed them the same thing she'd shown Jonah, but differently. With Jonah, she'd been precise and careful, aware of his skepticism, choosing her words to minimize the chance of argument. With the children, she just let them look. She put the plants in their hands. She let them smell things and ask questions that didn't always have neat answers. She answered as directly as she could. When the youngest, the boy on Hannah's hip, who turned out to be 4 and was named, Silas sat down in the mud next to a patch of purslane and began very seriously examining each stem one at a time. Hannah started to say something about the state of his clothes. Leave him, Elsie said, not unkindly. He's paying attention. That's the whole thing. Hannah left him. By afternoon, the 3 older children could identify 4 plants correctly and knew which parts were edible and which to avoid. They were also, Elsie noticed, considerably less frightened than they'd been when they arrived. That was the thing about knowledge. It had a way of displacing fear, not because it made things easier, but because it gave you something to do with your hands. Word moved the way word always moves in small settlements, faster than anyone intended and less accurately than anyone hoped. By the end of that week, 7 families had sent someone to Elsie's door. 3 of them came themselves. The others sent older children or younger siblings with a note, or just with a look of apology that served the same function as a note. Elsie fed whoever came. She couldn't always feed them well or generously. The stores she'd built up over the years were not unlimited, and she was careful about depleting what she'd dried and preserved before winter, still several weeks away, but she could always teach them. And teaching, she had discovered, was sometimes more valuable than the food itself. Her kitchen became something that resisted easy description. It wasn't quite a school. It wasn't quite a charity. It was more like a room where people came to learn how not to be helpless, which is a different thing from either of those. She showed them how to dry the lamb's quarters, spread thin on wooden frames in a warm, dry room, turned twice a day until they crumbled at the touch. She showed them how to pickle the wild onions in vinegar, which extended their usefulness from weeks to months. She showed them how to make a flour from dried and ground cattail roots, which was more work than it sounds, and produced a product that was gritty and somewhat bitter, but entirely edible and nutritious. She showed them how to make a broth from nettle stems that, combined with whatever scraps of dried meat or bone a family still had, produced something that felt like a real meal. Jonah, to his credit, had stopped being skeptical by the second day. By the end of the first week, he was actively helping, not with the plant knowledge, which was Elsie's domain entirely, but with the logistics, the carrying and organizing, the building of additional drying frames in the barn. He said little about it, which was characteristic of him, but he showed up and worked, said more. One evening, he tasted the nettle soup she'd been teaching people to make, stood at the stove and ate from the pot with a spoon, the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't watching. Well, she said. He turned around. It's good. I know. I mean, it's actually good. Not just I didn't say it to be kind. I know, she said again. Sit down, I'll get you a bowl. He sat down, and for a moment his face was open in a way it wasn't usually. Not quite embarrassed, but close to it. The face of a man who is processing the distance between what he assumed and what turns out to be true. I didn't understand, he said. No, I should have. Probably. She set the bowl in front of him. But you do now. That's something. Beatrice Crowe noticed. This was inevitable, in a settlement the size of Ash Creek, in a period of open crisis when people were hungry and frightened and pulling together in visible ways. Beatrice noticed everything. It was one of the things that had made her influential. She paid attention to the social landscape of the community with a precision that rivaled Elsie's attention to the physical one, and she had built her position on being the person who knew things first and understood their implications. What she saw, in the weeks after the beetle swarm, was the following. The woman everyone had always dismissed was now the woman everyone needed. This was not an easy thing for Beatrice to watch. She was not stupid, and she was not simple. And when she examined her own reaction honestly, which she did, occasionally, in the privacy of her own thoughts, she recognized that what she felt was not entirely admirable. She had laughed at Elsie Hartwell for years. Not viciously, not with malice, but steadily and publicly, and in ways that had consequences for how the community saw the woman. She had been one of the main architects of Elsie's reputation as the strange, heavy-set wife who wasted her mornings in the mud. And now the strange, heavy-set wife was keeping people alive. Beatrice was a practical woman. She understood at some level that she had been wrong. But understanding you've been wrong and being willing to correct it publicly are two very different things. And Beatrice had spent too many years building her identity on being right to find the second part manageable. What she needed, though she would not have put it this way, was a way to restore the balance. To find something that brought Elsie back down to the level that felt right. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the particular panic of a person who has organized their entire sense of themselves around a social position that is suddenly, visibly, shifting. She found her opening when Caleb Pierce got sick. Caleb was 11, the oldest son of James and Nora Pierce, a quiet boy with a serious face who had attended 2 of Elsie's sessions and had, Elsie thought, more natural aptitude for plant observation than almost any of the adults. He had shown her, at one point, a drawing he'd made of the creek bank near his family's land, rough but surprisingly accurate, with the plant locations marked in his own improvised notation. He developed a fever on a Tuesday. By Thursday it was high enough that his mother had stopped letting him out of bed, and by Friday the word had traveled through the community in the way that word about sick children always does, fast and heavy with implication. Elsie heard it from Hannah, who came to the door with her face carefully neutral, which was itself a signal. "People are talking," Hannah said. "About what?" "About Caleb." And about she stopped, looked down at her hands. "Beatrice is saying that the plants made him sick." Elsie was quiet for a moment. She felt something that was not quite surprised she had understood, on some level, that something like this was coming, but it sat in her chest like a stone, all the same. "What plant specifically?" "The lamb's quarters," she's saying. She's saying Caleb ate them, and that's what started the fever. "Caleb was at my session 8 days ago. The fever started Tuesday." "I know that. 8 days is not how that works. If it was the plants, you'd see a reaction within hours, a day at most." "I know that too," Hannah said quietly. "But Elsie, most people don't know that." And that was the thing. That was exactly the thing. The knowledge that made Elsie able to see clearly in this situation was the same knowledge that most of the community didn't have. And Beatrice, whether she fully understood what she was doing or come not, had chosen her target with a precision that was either intelligent or instinctive. Because what Beatrice was doing was not attacking the plants. She was attacking the knowledge, and without the knowledge, the plants were just weeds again. Elsie stood at her door for a long moment after Hannah left. Then she put on her coat, picked up her 4th journal, and went to find Mabel Whitcomb. Mabel Whitcomb was 81 years old and had been living in the valley longer than the settlement itself existed. She had arrived with her husband before there was a store or a road or a proper well, when the creek was the only thing you could count on, and she had outlasted him by 23 years, and outlasted 4 harsh winters that had sent younger people packing, and outlasted the kind of loneliness that would have destroyed most people. She had been eating Elsie's lamb's quarters soup once a week for 6 weeks, and was by every visible measure in better health than several people 30 years younger. Elsie found her at her kitchen table, shelling dried beans, which was what she was usually doing when Elsie came by, because Mabel had the old country habit of keeping her hands busy at all times, even when her mind was far away. "Sit," Mabel said without looking up. Elsie sat. "I heard about the Pierce boy," Mabel said. "Then you've heard what people are saying." "I've heard what Beatrice Crow is saying." Mabel's fingers moved steadily through the beans, not slowing. "There's a difference. She's saying the plants made him sick." "Plants didn't make him sick." "I know that. I know it too." Mabel set down the bowl and looked at Elsie for the first time since she'd come in. She had a face that had stopped being merely old and had become something else, textured and specific in the way that faces become when they've held a great number of expressions over a long time. "That boy has the valley fever. I've seen it before. Twice before, in fact. Once when my Samuel was young, once about 14 years ago. It comes in the fall. It goes after 10 days or 2 weeks. It's miserable, but it doesn't kill you." Elsie leaned forward. "You've seen it before. Both times it was children. Both times it started with high fever and the shakes, and then broke after about a week and a half." Mabel's expression was flat and direct. "Neither time did anyone eat your plants, because you weren't here yet." The implications of this settled over Elsie like cold water, and she noticed this shift in herself with a kind of grim satisfaction like solid ground. "Would you be willing to say that?" Elsie asked. Publicly? Mabel picked up the beans again. I'm 81 years old. There are not very many things I'm not willing to say. She paused. You bring that doctor when he comes through and you make sure I'm standing right there when you do. The traveling doctor arrived 4 days later. His name was Patterson, and he came through Ash Creek twice a year on a circuit that covered 6 settlements in a 50-mile radius. A thin man of about 50 with a worn leather bag and the particular manner of someone who has seen enough suffering to no longer be surprised by it, but has not yet stopped caring about it. Elsie met him at the road with Mabel beside her. She explained the situation in clear, plain terms: the beetle swarm, the food crisis, the wild plant lessons, Caleb's illness, and what was being said about the connection between them. She did not editorialize. She presented it as a sequence of events and let the sequence speak. Patterson listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Mabel. You've seen this presentation before, he said. Not a question. Twice, Mabel said. Same time of year, same age group, same pattern. I'd know it in my sleep. Patterson nodded slowly. Valley fever presents the way she's describing high-grade fever onset, roughly a week to 10 days before the break. He looked at Elsie. What did the boy eat in the 2 days before symptoms began? She told him what she knew, which was limited. She hadn't been at the Pierce household and was working from what Hannah had told her. But she knew when Caleb had last been at her sessions, and she knew what the timing looked like. 8 days is not a plant reaction, Patterson said simply. A plant reaction of that severity would present within 6 to 24 hours. 8 days is too long, and the symptom pattern is wrong anyway. He looked toward the settlement. I'll need to see the boy, and then I'll need to speak to whoever is spreading this, so we can stop it before someone makes a decision based on it that causes actual harm. He said that last part in a tone that was very even and not especially kind. Elsie walked with him to the Pierce house and waited on the porch while he examined Caleb. When he came out, he spent about 3 minutes speaking with Nora Pierce in a low, steady voice on the porch steps. Then he went to find Beatrice Crow. Elsie did not go with him for that part. But the settlement was small enough that she heard, in pieces, what was said. Patterson had not been gentle. He had been factual and thorough, and public. He had said what he needed to say within earshot of several people, which meant that by the following morning it was as widely known as anything that passed through Ash Creek could be. Caleb Pierce had the valley fever. He had not been poisoned. Plants were not responsible, and the community would do well, Patterson had said, to direct its anxiety about the crisis toward the actual crisis, rather than toward the woman who was doing the most to address it. It was not by any means the end of it, but it was the moment the ground shifted. Elsie stood at her kitchen window the night after Patterson left, the valley dark and still outside, Jonah's breathing behind her, steady and slow, and she understood that whatever came next was going to require something different from her. Not just knowledge, not just the correct information at the correct moment. She had spent years learning how to read the land. What she was just beginning to understand was that reading a community was its own entirely separate and harder discipline. She was not by any measure finished with the lesson. The night Patterson left Ash Creek, Beatrice Crow did not sleep. This was not in itself unusual. She was a woman who had always slept lightly, waking at small sounds and lying in the dark, with her thoughts arranged around her like furniture she couldn't stop rearranging. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality than the ordinary kind. It was the kind that came from having been publicly corrected, which is among the most uncomfortable experiences available to a person who has built their entire social existence on being the one who knows things first and says them loudest. Patterson had not screamed at her. He had not accused her directly or called her a liar in terms that left no room for interpretation. He had been worse than that. He had been precise. He had laid out the facts in a sequence that left no honest exit, and he had done it within earshot of enough people that there was no version of events she could construct afterward that would hold up. She lay in the dark and felt the particular shame of a person who has done something they cannot fully justify and cannot take back. In the morning, she got up and made breakfast and did not speak about it to anyone. That silence was, for Beatrice, its own kind of decision. Families who had pulled back from Elsie after the rumors started did not all return at once. That was not how it worked, and Elsie had not expected it to. Communities move the way rivers do not in straight lines, not all at once, but in a general direction that becomes clear only after some time has passed. People were embarrassed, and embarrassed people rarely walk directly back to the thing they flinched away from. They approach it sideways. They come with small pretexts, a question about a specific plant, a request to borrow one of the journals, a child sent ahead as a scout to gauge the temperature of the welcome. Elsie let them come however they needed to come. She was not, she told Jonah one evening, interested in making people feel worse than they already did. "You're more forgiving than I am," he said. "I'm not forgiving anything," she said. "I'm just practical. They're scared and they made a mistake. That's what people do. I can be angry about it, or I can keep feeding them. I don't have enough energy for both." Jonah looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to think of as his honest face, the one without any of the social performance, without the careful calculation of how things looked. "You have enough energy for both," he said. "You're just choosing not to." She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. What she did not tell him, what she had not yet fully worked out in her own mind, was that the choice to keep going, keep opening her kitchen and her journals and her mornings at the creek to whoever needed them, was not made from a place of pure generosity. It was made, at least in part, from stubbornness, from the same deep stubbornness that had made her crouch at creek banks in the early morning cold, while people laughed from a comfortable distance. Going to be right about this. She was going to be right about all of it in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away. And the only path to that was through the work. Sentiment had nothing to do with it. Hannah Pike became, without either of them planning it, Elsie's closest collaborator. It happened gradually, the way most real things do, not through a single conversation or decision, but through accumulation. Hannah had come to Elsie's door first among the neighbors, and she had stayed the most consistently, and she had the kind of practical intelligence that expressed itself not in ideas, but in application. Where Elsie could identify a plant and explain its properties with precision, Hannah could figure out, in about 15 minutes of experimentation, the best way to prepare it for children who didn't want to eat it. Where Elsie's journal entries were systematic and precise, Hannah's questions were the kind that came from actual meals in front of actual hungry people. "The lamb's quarters are fine when they're fresh," Hannah told her one morning, the two of them sitting at Elsie's kitchen table with a pile of dried plant material between them. "But when I dried them and tried to rehydrate them, they came out with a texture that Rosie said she'd rather starve than eat." "Did you dry them in shade or sun?" "Sun, it was faster." "Try shade. Slower, but they hold the color and the texture better." Elsie picked up a dried leaf and rubbed it between her fingers. "Also try grinding them when they're dried and adding the powder to the flour mix instead of reconstituting them separately. You lose some nutrition, but you get something the children will actually finish." Hannah wrote this down in the small notebook she'd started carrying. Elsie noticed it but didn't comment. The fact that Hannah had started her own record was one of those things that landed quietly and meant more than it seemed to. "What about the cattail flour?" Hannah asked. "I tried the recipe you showed me." The bread was, she paused diplomatically. "Bad," Elsie said. "Very dense and bitter. Mix it with half wild onion powder. The bitterness cuts. And don't try to make a risen loaf. It doesn't have the gluten structure for it. Flatten it and cook it on the pan like a griddle cake. Still not going to taste like wheat bread, but it's edible." "What does it taste like?" Elsie considered. "Something you eat when you're hungry enough that the specifics don't matter much. But it's nourishing. That's the point." Hannah nodded. She wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. "Rosie asked me last night if she could come to the creek with you this week. Not to learn to cook, just to look." Elsie raised her eyebrows slightly. "She wants to make her own drawings. Plants." Hannah had a look that was somewhere between proud and slightly uncertain. The expression of a parent who isn't quite sure if their child's interest is practical or fanciful, and isn't sure which answer she's hoping for. Told her I'd ask. "Tell her to come Tuesday morning," Elsie said. "Early, and tell her to bring something to draw on. I'll show her what's worth looking at." Rosie Pike was 13 and had her mother's quick eyes and her father's stubborn jaw and neither parent's particular talent for being comfortable around people she didn't know well. She arrived Tuesday morning at Elsie's door, exactly on time, which Elsie noted, because promptness in a 13-year-old was something that deserved acknowledgement. She had a piece of folded paper and a stub of charcoal pencil in her coat pocket. She showed them to Elsie without being asked, as if presenting credentials. "Good," Elsie said. "Let's go." They walked to the creek mostly in silence. Rosie was not a girl who filled quiet with chatter, which Elsie appreciated. She asked one question on the way, "Do you have a favorite plant?" And when Elsie said watercress, "Probably," Rosie nodded as if this was useful information and didn't ask anything else. At the creek, Elsie showed her things in the same way she'd been showing everyone plants in their locations, not as specimens, but as living things in specific conditions. She explained what each plant needed and what it gave back, and how you could look at the land around a plant and understand something about what you'd find there. But with Rosie, she went slower. She let the silences be longer. Because she noticed that Rosie was drawing, and she noticed that Rosie was good, not in a trained way, but in a seeing way. The way of someone whose hand moves to match what her eye actually registers, rather than what she expects to see. The watercress sketch she made, crouched beside the creek with the charcoal stub moving steadily, looked like watercress, not like a child's idea of what a plant looks like. "You've done this before," Elsie said. "Drawn things?" "Yes. But mostly animals, the dog. A hawk I saw once." Rosie looked at her drawing critically. "Plants are harder because the detail is smaller." "That's exactly right. Did you learn to draw?" "Not formally. Taught myself because I needed the plants on paper so I'd recognize them again later." Elsie looked at the girl's sketch. "You're better at it than I was starting out." Rosie looked up. She had the particular expression of a child receiving a compliment from an adult she respects, not beaming, but quietly absorbing it, setting it somewhere it would be useful. They spent 3 hours at the creek. By the time they walked back, Rosie had 4 drawings and a page of notes written in handwriting so small Elsie had to hold the paper close to read it. She had also, without being asked, memorized the identifying characteristics of 6 plants. She recited back to Elsie on the walk home with the accuracy of someone who had been paying real attention. "Tuesday next week?" Rosie asked at Elsie's gate. "Tuesday next week," Elsie said. She watched the girl walk down the road, her coat collar up, the paper folded back into her pocket, and she felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not pride, exactly, since Rosie wasn't hers. Something more like recognition, the specific feeling of watching a younger version of a particular quality pass by and knowing that it will find its way, regardless of what obstacles it meets. The lessons in Elsie's kitchen continued and expanded. What had started with individuals coming 1 or 2 at a time had, by the 3rd week, developed into something closer to an organized gathering. People came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, mornings mostly, while the light was good for the drying and pressing work, and before the afternoon chores crowded everything else out. Elsie ran it without formal structure, because formal structure had a way of making people feel they were doing something official, which made them self-conscious, and self-conscious people didn't learn as well as people who felt they were simply in a kitchen, watching something useful get done. She showed them drying methods. She showed them storage, how to pack dried greens in cloth rather than wood, which absorbed moisture and caused rot. She showed them how to tell by smell and texture when dried food had turned and when it was still good. She showed them the pickling process for wild onions and purslane, the proportions of vinegar and salt that preserved without destroying the flavor entirely. The men who came, and some did come, not many, but some were harder to teach than the women. Not because they were less capable, but because they had more invested in not appearing to need instruction, especially from a woman, especially about something they'd spent years treating as beneath notice. Elsie learned to give them tasks that felt operational rather than educational. "Hand me those, hold this, tell me what you think about the texture of this batch compared to last week's." It was a slight dishonesty, and she was aware of it, but it got them doing things with their hands. And once their hands were involved, the learning followed whether they intended it to or not. Gideon Pike, Hannah's husband, Rosie's father, came once, the first week. He was a big, weathered man who carried the specific dignity of someone who has worked very hard for a long time and organized his self-respect around that fact. He stood in Elsie's kitchen with his arms crossed for the first 20 minutes, watching without participating, with the expression of a man attending something under duress. Then Elsie asked him, without looking up from what she was doing, whether he'd noticed that the wild rose canes along his north fence had gone heavy with hips this year. He uncrossed his arms. "I noticed," he said. "I didn't know what to do with it. High in nutrition. Easy to process. If you picked them in the next week before the first hard freeze, you'd have enough to supplement your family through mid-January." She glanced at him. "Your fence runs about 30 yards the north side. I could tell you exactly what you'd be looking for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked over to the table and looked at what she was doing. Stayed for 2 hours. He didn't say much, but he stayed. The wild onion harvest was the day everything almost fell apart. Elsie had organized it as a group activity, a morning out at the waste ground, east of the settlement where the largest stand grew, bringing several families together to harvest enough to pickle a significant quantity before the ground hardened. It made practical sense, and it also made social sense, Because people who harvest together stop thinking of the food as charity and start thinking of it as something they produce themselves, which was important for their willingness to keep coming back. 12 people arrived that morning. 4 adults, 8 children, across several families. They arrived in separate clusters, not quite comfortable with each other yet. The way people are when they've been pulled together by circumstance rather than choice. The first hour went well. Elsie showed them the onions, demonstrated the harvest technique, and then set everyone to work, moving through the group to correct and redirect and answer questions. The children fell into it quickly, they always did, and by mid-morning there was a decent pile accumulating, and the atmosphere had shifted from strained to something closer to ordinary. Then Thomas Crow showed up. It was Beatrice's husband, and he was not there to join the harvest. He was there. Elsie understood within about 30 seconds of seeing his face, because Beatrice had sent him. He stood at the edge of the waste ground with his hat in his hands, which might have looked humble but didn't feel it, and he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that he'd heard there were people eating plants off land that hadn't been properly examined for use. The group went quiet. Elsie straightened up from where she'd been crouched beside a cluster of onions. She looked at Thomas Crow. He was a man who was not comfortable with what he was doing. She could see that clearly his jaw was tight, and his eyes moved around the group without settling, but he was going to do it anyway, because he had been sent to do it, and because whatever hold Beatrice had over his behavior was apparently stronger than his discomfort. All of this ground was examined, Elsie said. I've been documenting it for 4 years. If you'd like to see the records, I have them at the house. I'm not saying you don't know the plants, Thomas said. He was choosing his words with the care of someone who has been given a script that doesn't quite fit the situation. I'm saying the settlement should have some kind of agreement. Some kind of before people go eating things off common land, there should be a process. What process? Said Gideon Pike from behind Elsie. Thomas looked at him, slightly startled. He had not apparently expected Gideon Pike to be there. Gideon was not a man who typically involved himself in things like this, and his presence was a data point that didn't fit Beatrice's model of the situation. I'm just saying there ought to be. My children ate what Elsie prepared 2 weeks ago, and they're standing here, Gideon said. His voice was level. My youngest is healthier than he's been since September. He looked at Thomas steadily. I'm not interested in a process. I'm interested in making sure my family makes it to spring. Thomas opened his mouth and then closed it. If Beatrice has a concern, Gideon continued, she's welcome to bring it to Elsie directly. That's how it's done. Thomas put his hat back on. He stood there for another moment that stretched out uncomfortably, and then he left, walking back toward the settlement with his shoulders set in a way that suggested he was going to have an unpleasant conversation when he got home. The group watched him go. Then, without anyone saying anything particularly significant, they went back to the harvest. Elsie crouched back down next to her onions and kept working, but her hands weren't quite steady, and she knew it. She had held herself still and spoke calmly and done exactly what needed to be done in the moment. But the thing about Beatrice was that she didn't stop. Each confrontation was not the last one. It was a probe, a test, a way of finding the edges of what she could do. Thomas walking away was not a resolution. It was a pause. Later at the fence line, Gideon fell into step beside her as the group broke up to head home. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm not doing it for you, he said, in a way that was blunt but not unkind. I'm doing it for my family. He paused. But that means doing it for you. Same thing in this case. She nodded. It was, she thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to her in recent memory. The letter appeared on her doorstep on a Thursday morning. Elsie found it when she went out before dawn, tucked under the edge of the door in a way that meant someone had placed it in the dark, not wanting to be seen. Paper was folded once. Inside, in handwriting that was unfamiliar and had the labored quality of someone writing more slowly than they normally spoke, it said, "Stop your lessons before you hurt another child." No name. No date. She stood in the cold with the paper in her hand for a long moment. Then she folded it back up and took it inside and put it in the back of her 4th journal, between 2 pages near the end, in the way she filed other things she needed to remember but didn't want to look at every day. She did not show it to Jonah. She showed it to Hannah the following Tuesday, when Hannah came for the morning session. Hannah read it, and her face went tight. When did you get this? Thursday last. And you waited 4 days to... I needed to think about what to do with it before I said anything. Hannah looked at her. Who wrote it? I don't know. Could be anyone. Could be someone acting on their own out of genuine fear. Could be someone Beatrice influenced. Doesn't change what I need to do. Which is, keep going. Elsie took the note back and put it in her pocket. If I stop, people stop eating. That's the only practical consideration. Hannah was quiet. She had the look of someone who wants to argue, but can see that the argument isn't going to find any purchase. I don't know how you do that, she finally said. Do what? Hannah gestured vaguely. Keep going. After something like that. What's the alternative? Being afraid. I'm afraid, Elsie said. I'm afraid most of the time, if I'm honest. I'm afraid the food won't hold. I'm afraid the winter will be worse than we're prepared for. I'm afraid people are going to make decisions based on what Beatrice is saying that hurt them or their children. She paused. But being afraid and stopping are two different things. You can do the first one while still not doing the second one. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. You should have been a teacher, she said. I am a teacher, Elsie said. That's what we've been doing for 3 weeks. Caleb Pierce recovered on a Sunday. Nora Pierce came to Elsie's door that same afternoon, which surprised Elsie. She had not expected the visit, and she was not prepared for it, in the way she was usually prepared for interactions with her neighbors. She had been in the middle of something messy at the stove, there, and her apron was stained, and she answered the door, looking considerably less composed than she'd have chosen. But Nora's face stopped her from thinking about any of that. Nora was a small, contained woman who had always seemed to Elsie to be held together by the force of not showing things, the way a seam holds cloth. She was standing on the porch with her hands clasped in front of her, and something in her face had changed. Some layer of the containment had come undone, leaving something underneath that was raw and a little undirected, the way people look when they've been frightened for a long time. And the fear has just started to ease. He's up, Nora said Caleb. He ate some soup this morning and he's been up and talking. I'm glad, Elsie said, and meant it entirely. Nora stopped. Tried again, when people were saying things. About the plants. I should have said something. Elsie waited. I knew it wasn't right. I knew Caleb hadn't been sick until 8 days after he'd eaten anything from your lessons, and I did the counting. In my head, I knew. Nora's hands tightened against each other. But Beatrice came by the house and she was so certain. Caleb was so sick, and I was frightened. And it's easier to believe something has a cause you can point to than to just be frightened without knowing why. I know, Elsie said. I'm not excusing it, I know that too. I just wanted to say. Nora unclenched her hands. I'm sorry for not speaking up. Elsie looked at her for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where she said something gracious and closed the door and felt righteous about it. And there was this version. Come in, she said. I'll show you the rosehip preparation. Caleb could use the nutrition while he's getting his strength back. Nora blinked. You'd still teach me? Why wouldn't I? Nora didn't have an answer for that. She came in. Community's turn was not a single moment, and it was not clean. What happened was more like the change in a field after rain. You couldn't point to the exact moment the ground went from dry to wet, but after a certain point the difference was undeniable. Families that had pulled back began returning, one by one and then in small groups. The anonymous letter was not the last. There were 2 more over the next 2 weeks, and Elsie filed them both in the same place, in her journal, but they stopped having the effect they might have had a month earlier, because enough people had now been in Elsie's kitchen, had eaten what she prepared, had seen their children learn to identify things in the creek bank and come home with something useful in their hands, that the abstract fear was running out of room to breathe. The shift was visible in small things. The women who had avoided her at the well began meeting her eyes again. A man named Aldous Green, who had returned the jar of dried lamb's quarters she'd given him in the first frightened week after the rumors started, knocked on her door one morning and asked, without quite looking at her, whether there was any more he could have. She gave him 2 jars without comment. He left without saying anything else, but he came to the Thursday session the following week and stayed the whole morning. The children were easiest. Children don't carry embarrassment the way adults do, and the knowledge Elsie had given them had the kind of practical glamour that appeals directly to the young, the ability to walk through land that looks empty and see what is actually there, the specific pride of knowing something that most adults didn't. Caleb Pierce, once he was well enough to be outside, began ranging across his family's land with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, mapping every plant he could find and comparing his map to Elsie's journals. He knocked on her door 3 times in the first week of his recovery, with questions that were better than most of the questions adults had asked her, and she answered them fully, because that was what they deserved. The map he eventually produced was crude and ambitious, and covered an area about 10 times the size of what any single family would need. When he showed it to her, unfolding it carefully on her kitchen table, she looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I know some of the identifications might be wrong," he said. He was nervous. She could see that in the way he held the edges of the paper, ready to fold it back up at any moment if she dismissed it. "Some of them are." She pointed to one notation. "This one here, by the east fence that's not purslane, it's a lookalike that's not safe to eat. I'll show you how to tell the difference. The rest of what you've got here," she looked up at him. "This is good work, Caleb," he exhaled. "Serious work," she said. "Not something a person does casually." He looked at the map for a moment, then at her. "I want to know all of it," he said. "Not just what's safe to eat. All of it. What the land is, what all of it means." Elsie looked at him. He was 11 years old, and had been sick for 2 weeks, and had just gotten up from his bed, and the first thing he'd done was walk the land with a piece of paper. "That's going to take a long time," she said. "I know," he said. "I've got time." She folded the map back up and handed it to him. "Come, Saturday morning," she said, "early. We'll start with the basics." It was on a Wednesday in the 4th week that Jonah came home from talking with the other farmers at the pizza store with something different in his face. He sat down at the supper table and didn't say anything for a while, which was not unusual for him. Jonah processed things before speaking, always had. Elsie put food in front of him and waited. "Gideon talked today," Jonah said finally. "To who?" "To everyone who was there." At the store, he looked at his plate. He stood up and set it in front of whoever was listening. "About Caleb and the plants and what you've been doing." He paused. "He said his children are alive because of you." Elsie set down her fork. "He didn't say it like a speech," Jonah said. "He said it like a fact. Like he was correcting something that needed correcting." He looked at her. Nobody argued with him. She was quiet. "There were about 12 men there," Jonah continued. "Some of them have been saying things I'm not going to repeat at this table. None of them said anything when Gideon spoke." He picked up his spoon. "I don't know if that means they agreed, or just didn't have the nerve to argue with Gideon Pike. Could be either. Could be both," Elsie said. "Could be both," he agreed. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the first real cold of the season was pressing against the window, and the fire had to work harder than it had the week before. "I was wrong," Jonah said. Elsie looked at him. He had said it once before, at the creek, but this was different. This was the supper table. This was inside the ordinary rhythm of their life, and it was without the particular atmosphere of that morning's revelation to carry it. "About what specifically?" she said. "About all of it." He didn't look away. "About worrying more about what people said than about what you were doing. About not asking. About," he stopped. Started again. "You've been right about this the whole time. Not just about the plants. About the whole thing, about what matters." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who said things like this easily, and she knew that, and she knew what it cost him. "All right," she said. "That's all? What do you want me to say, Jonah?" "Thought about it." "Nothing, I suppose." He picked up his spoon again. "Just that." The wind moved against the house. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the settlement of Ash Creek was settling into its cold evening families in their houses, with their stores and their worries, and whatever remained of the summer's harvest, and in more kitchens than Elsie knew, jars of dried lamb's quarters on shelves and little notebooks with plant sketches, and children who could walk a creek bank and come home with something in their hands. What she had built was fragile still, and she knew it. One bad piece of information, one sick child that couldn't be explained, one well-placed word from the right person at the wrong moment, and it could come apart faster than it had assembled. The anonymous letters in her journal were a reminder of that. Thomas Crow, walking to the harvest ground with his hat in his hands, was a reminder of that. And Beatrice was still there, still present, still quiet in the way that something is quiet before it moves. Elsie cleared the table and washed the dishes and filed it all away, the letters and the gossip, and Gideon's public statement, and Caleb's map, and Nora's apology on the porch. She filed it the same way she filed plant observations in her journal, not to dwell on it, but to understand it, to know where things stood. The land always had something to say, her grandmother had told her. You just had to learn how to listen. She was beginning to understand that people worked the same way. Couldn't force a root to grow in the wrong season. Couldn't make a plant thrive in soil it wasn't suited for. You could prepare the conditions and do the work and wait. You could be patient in the way that someone who understands growth is patient, not passive, not resigned, but active in the way that watching carefully is active. and ready in the way that knowing what you're looking for makes you ready. The hard winter was still coming, and Beatrice Crowe still had something to say. But in the kitchens and the creek banks and the little notebooks of Ash Creek, something was growing that had not been there before the beetles came. Something that didn't require Elsie's permission to keep going. Something that was beginning, slowly and unevenly and with all the difficulty of real things, to take root on its own. The third anonymous letter arrived on a Friday, and this one was different from the first two. The first two had been warnings. Stop before you hurt someone. Stop before it gets worse. The kind of thing a frightened person writes when they want to feel like they've done something without actually having to confront anyone. Elsie had filed them and continued without changing anything about what she was doing, which was the correct response, and she knew it. Third letter was not a warning. It was a list. Someone had written out, in that same labored handwriting, the names of 7 children who had attended Elsie's sessions. Next to each name was a notation, a minor complaint, a small ailment, a bad week of sleep, a stomachache that had resolved in 2 days. Nothing serious. Nothing that any reasonable person would connect to anything Elsie had taught or prepared. But written out in that format, in that sequence, the list had a cumulative weight that was different from the individual items. It looked on paper like evidence. Elsie sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter in front of her. Then she took out her own journal and wrote down the date and what the letter said, word for word, and then she wrote down what she knew about each of the 7 children when they'd attended sessions, what they'd eaten, and what she knew of the ailments mentioned. 2 of the children she had no record of at all regarding the complaints listed, which meant the complaints had either been invented or had happened before the children ever came to her kitchen. 3 of the others had attended sessions weeks before the ailments appeared. One child, a 4-year-old named Petra Aldous, had a recurring digestive sensitivity that her own mother had mentioned to Elsie when she brought her, something that predated the beetle swarm by at least a year. She wrote all of this down carefully in the same systematic way she wrote plant observations, because she had learned from the Caleb situation that the truth was only useful if it was documented in a form someone else could follow. Then she folded the letter and put it with the others and went to find Hannah. Hannah's reaction was less measured than Elsie's. She read the list twice, her face going through several expressions that she didn't bother controlling, and then she set it on the table between them with a care that suggested she wanted to do something else with it entirely. "This is Beatrice," she said. "The handwriting isn't hers. That doesn't mean it isn't Beatrice." Hannah looked at her. "She has people who would do this for her. Thomas won't, not anymore, not after the harvest ground. But there are others." She tapped the paper. "Petra Aldous. Her mother has been coming to your sessions for 2 weeks. Why would she be on a list like this if her mother is one of the people you're teaching? She wouldn't be if the list was accurate." Elsie folded it again. "Point. This isn't about accuracy. It's about the impression it creates if enough people see it before they think about it too carefully. You think Beatrice is going to show this around? I think it's already being shown around. Why write it down and deliver it to me unless you want me to know it exists? It's not a warning. Statement. She's telling me she's been collecting." Hannah was quiet. She picked up her tea and put it down without drinking. "What do you do with that?" "I don't know yet." Elsie was honest about this in a way she wouldn't have been with most people. With Hannah, the honesty was possible because Hannah had been in the kitchen every week, had seen the work and understood what it was, and wouldn't interpret uncertainty as weakness. "I know what I'm not going to do," which is attack her directly. That turns into a fight between 2 women and people pick sides, and the knowledge gets buried in the noise. "So you wait, I prepare." Elsie pulled her journal toward her. "Everything I know about those 7 children, I'm documenting. Every session date, every person present, everything prepared and eaten, everything I know about their health before and after. If this list reaches the kind of person who can act on it, if Beatrice takes it to someone with authority over the settlement, I need something better than my word." Hannah looked at the journal. "That's a lot of work. I've been doing a lot of work for 4 years. This is just more of the same kind." The person Beatrice took it to was not who Elsie expected. She had anticipated Thomas, possibly, despite his reluctance after the harvest ground confrontation. She had anticipated one of the older men who ran the settlement's informal council, not a real council, nothing elected or official, the half-dozen men whose opinions carried more weight than others, simply because they'd been there longest and spoke loudest. But she had prepared for that version of the confrontation. She had not prepared for Reverend Aldous. He was not actually a reverend in any formal sense, Ash Creek had no official church, no ordained minister, no established congregation. He was simply the man who led the informal Sunday gatherings that some families attended and others didn't, and he had taken on the honorific through a combination of genuine seriousness about the role and the community's practical need for someone to play it. His name was Gerald Aldous, and he was Petra's grandfather, the father of the man whose daughter appeared on the list. He knocked on Elsie's door on a Saturday morning in the 5th week. Jonah answered it, because Jonah was near the door, and Elsie heard his voice before she saw who it was. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped when she saw Gerald Aldous standing in her doorway with the particular expression of a man who has been tasked with something he doesn't entirely want to do but has committed to doing properly. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. He had the letter in his hand, not folded open, held in a way that established immediately what the conversation was about. Jonah stepped aside, which was the right instinct. "Come in," Elsie said. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. Jonah stood at the edge of the room, which was exactly where she needed him present, but not inserting himself. Gerald Aldous was a careful man. She had observed this about him before, without the observation being particularly relevant. He was the kind of person who assembled his thoughts for releasing them, which gave his speech a deliberate quality that could be mistaken for coldness, but was really just method. He set the letter on the table between them, face up. "You've seen this," he said. "I have my own copy." He looked slightly surprised. "Someone sent you one?" "Yes." "Do you know who wrote it?" "The handwriting isn't familiar to me." She kept her voice level. "Do you?" He didn't answer directly, which was its own answer. "I'm coming to you because Petra's granddaughter, and her name is on this list, and I think you deserve to know that. I appreciate that. I'm also coming because—" He stopped, looked at the letter, "because I want to understand what happened, not what I've been told, what actually happened." Elsie looked at him for a moment. This was a different conversation than she had prepared for, and she made a quick internal adjustment, setting aside the careful documentation she'd been building in her head and approaching it more directly. "What did Petra eat?" she said. "In the week before her stomach trouble." He frowned. "I don't know exactly." "What her parents had, I suppose." "Did her parents attend any of my sessions?" "Her mother did. Once, I think." "What did she bring home?" He didn't know. "Do you know what Petra's stomach trouble looked like?" "Specifically?" Elsie asked. "When it started, how long it lasted, whether she'd had it before." "She's had trouble before," he said slowly. "Since she was an infant, her mother says. Something sensitive about her digestion. That's what her mother told me when she brought her to the session. She mentioned it before Petra ate anything at all. She mentioned it so I'd know, in case we were preparing something that might affect her, which is exactly what a careful mother does." Elsie paused. "I gave Petra plain watercress broth, nothing else. Nothing that would cause a digestive reaction in a child with a sensitivity like hers." Aldous was quiet. "I have documentation of every session, every family that attended, everything prepared. I've been keeping it since the 1st week." She did not take out the journal. She didn't need to, and showing it might make the conversation feel like a defense, which was a different thing from an explanation. "Petra's name should not be on that list. Not because I say so, but because the timeline doesn't hold up. Came to one session, 3 weeks before she had any trouble." 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. He looked at the letter. He picked it up and looked at it for a long moment, and she could see him doing the kind of arithmetic that people do when they've been given information that doesn't match what they assumed, when they're trying to figure out whether the assumption or the information needs to change. "Who gave you this?" she asked. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket. "Someone who I think was frightened," he said carefully, "and being used by someone less frightened." He stood up. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite absolution. It was something more honest than either. The expression of a man who has made an error in judgment, and is trying to correct without making a production of it. "I'll look into this more carefully," he said. "That's all I'd ask," she said. He left. Jonah closed the door behind him and turned around. "That was Beatrice," he said. "Through 2 people, yes. What does she want?" Elsie picked up her journal from the table. "I think she wants what she's always wanted, which is for things to be the way they were before. When I was the strange woman at the creek, and she was the person everyone listened to, she opened the journal to where she'd been writing. You can't unteach something. Once people know how to find food in that creek bank, they know it. You can discredit the teacher, but you can't take back what she taught. Is that what she's trying to do? Discredit you?" I think she started out wanting to restore the balance, and it's become something else. Elsie smoothed the page. I think it's become about the fact that she knows she was wrong, and the only way to live with that comfortably is to make me wrong first. The session that Tuesday was smaller than usual. 3 families instead of the usual 6 or 7. Hannah was there, and the Pike children, and a young woman named Dora Marsh, who had started coming recently and said almost nothing during sessions, but absorbed everything with the attention of someone drinking from a long drought. The others had sent word, various reasons, various excuses, the kind of excuses that are true on their surface and mean something else underneath. Elsie taught what she always taught. She was aware of the smaller numbers and the reason for them, but she made a deliberate choice not to address it, not to acknowledge the list or the rumors or the particular quality of the silence where the absent families should have been. She had learned in the creek bank and in her years of documentation that the worst thing you could do when conditions changed was to stop paying attention to what was actually in front of you and start paying attention to what was missing. What was in front of her was Dora Marsh, who had arrived that morning with a question written on a small piece of paper because she was afraid she would forget it. Question was, how do you know, when you find a plant you don't recognize, whether it's safe to try? It was a better question than it appeared to be. Most people, when they asked about safety, were asking about specific plants. Is this one okay? Is that one dangerous? Dora was asking about the process, about the methodology, about how you build reliable knowledge when you can't look something up and can't ask someone who already knows. Elsie spent 40 minutes on that question. She explained the observation sequence. She used the smell test first, then the visual characteristics, then what she called the family check, meaning whether the plant had the structural signatures of a known safe family or a known dangerous one. She explained the tasting protocol her grandmother had taught her, which involved the tiniest possible quantity, held against the lip first, then the tongue tip, then a very small amount actually eaten, with significant time between each step and careful attention to any response. She explained why you wrote it down, why you compared it against what you already knew, why you came back to the same plant in different seasons to understand how it changed. It's not fast, she said, and it's not certain. You can do everything right and still make a mistake. Point is to reduce the chance of a bad mistake by making your process as careful as possible. Dora wrote all of this down. After the session, when Hannah was helping clean up and the Pike children had gone out to the yard, Dora stopped at the door with her coat half on. I heard about the letter, she said. The list. Elsie looked at her. Where did you hear, my neighbor? She got one too, I think, or saw one. She was going to stop coming. Dora finished buttoning her coat, decided that was the wrong response. Why? Dora looked at her steadily. She was perhaps 20 and had the look of someone who had been underestimated enough times that she'd gotten comfortable with it. Because I'm hungry, she said, and what you're teaching works. Those are the only facts that matter to me right now. She left. Hannah appeared at the kitchen doorway. I like her, she said. She's smart, Elsie said. She asks the right questions. So do you. Hannah started drying a jar. Gerald Aldous was at the well this morning. He looked like a man who's had a difficult week. Did he say anything? He said he'd looked into some things and found them not to be what he'd been told. Hannah set down the jar. He said it to Aldous Green, who tells everything to everyone. So by this time tomorrow, most of the settlement will know he said it. Elsie was quiet for a moment. That's something. It's not enough. Something. What broke the balance, finally, irreversibly, was not what Elsie had planned for. She had prepared for the formal version of the conflict, the kind that could be met with documentation and testimony, and the sequential laying out of facts. She had not prepared for what actually happened, which was quiet and small and devastatingly simple. Mabel Whitcomb got sick. Not seriously, she was 81, and the cold was hitting harder than the previous weeks, and she had a chest cough that developed on a Monday and worsened by Wednesday. It was not, in any medical sense, alarming. Patterson had told Mabel years ago that in a woman her age, winter chest coughs were to be taken seriously, but were not automatically dangerous, and Mabel herself was entirely undramatic about it. She sent word to Elsie through a neighbor, not asking for help specifically, just notifying her the way neighbors notify each other of things. What Beatrice did with this information was the most effective thing she'd done yet. She didn't make an accusation, she didn't write a letter. She did something far more difficult to counter. She began asking questions. Concerned questions, delivered in a quiet and genuinely sounding worried tone. To the women at the well, to the families she ran into in the settlement, to Gerald Aldous, who was still in the process of recalibrating his own position and was therefore vulnerable to new information. She asked whether Mabel had been eating Elsie's preparations. She asked, with a look of careful distress, whether anyone had considered that an 81-year-old woman's system might not handle wild plants the same way a younger person's would. She didn't say Elsie had made Mabel sick. She didn't need to. Question did the work. And because Mabel was old and beloved, and because nobody wanted to be the person who had contributed to harm coming to her, the question landed in the community's collective anxiety like a stone in still water. Elsie heard it from 3 separate people in the space of 2 days. She went to Mabel. Mabel was in her chair by the window, wrapped in a wool blanket with a cup of something steaming in her hands. And she looked, to Elsie's genuine relief, like a woman with a chest cough rather than a woman in serious distress. Her color was acceptable, and her eyes were sharp, and the first thing she said when Elsie came through the door was, "I assume you heard." "I heard," Elsie said. She sat in the chair across from her. "Beatrice Crow," Mabel said, with the particular brevity of someone who has lived long enough to have no patience left for unnecessary words. "She's not saying you're sick because of me directly. She's asking the question. I know how she's doing it. I've seen it done before by other people in other places. Question is more powerful than the accusation because you can't refute a question the same way you can refute a statement." Mabel drank from her cup. "I have a chest cough. I get them every winter. I got them before you came to Ash Creek, and I'll get them after, assuming I'm still here. Will you say that to people?" "I've already said it to the 2 women who came by pretending to check on me, but actually checking on you." Mabel's expression was dry. "I sent them home, knowing exactly what they came wanting to confirm." Elsie looked at her. "You're not worried about Beatrice?" "No." "About the cough?" "Somewhat. I'm 81, I'm allowed to take a cough seriously without being dramatic about it." She adjusted the blanket. "I'm more worried about you. About me. You're trying to do everything right, and that's not always enough. You know that." Mabel looked at her directly. "Beatrice isn't fighting about plants anymore. She's fighting about who gets to define the truth in this community. And that's a different kind of fight. I know. Do you know what you need to win it?" Elsie was quiet. "You need someone to stand up," Mabel said. "Not because you ask them to. Not because they're your husband or your friend or in debt to you in some way. You need someone who doesn't owe you anything to stand up and say what's true because they've decided it matters." She looked out the window. "That's the kind of testimony that changes things. Everything else is just noise." Jonah was the one who started it. Not because Elsie asked him to, she hadn't in fact. Because she was still trying to work out whether asking him would help or whether it would look like a husband defending a wife, which was a different thing from someone defending what was true. She was still turning it over when he came home on Thursday and told her what he'd done. He had gone to Gideon Pike, not to ask him to speak, not to organize anything. He had simply gone to Gideon, directly, and told him about the list and about Mabel and about what Beatrice was doing. And he had said, without any particular diplomatic framing, "I think this is wrong, and I think you know it's wrong, and I think you're one of the few people whose saying so would matter." Gideon had been silent for a long moment. Then he'd said when and where. Jonah told Elsie this at the kitchen table, in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to report on the state of the fence line, which was his way of delivering significant news. He had learned over 3 years of marriage that Elsie responded better to plainly stated facts than to presentations of them. She was quiet for a moment. "The well," she said. "Saturday morning. That's when the most people pass through. I'll tell Gideon." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the honest face, the one without performance, and she recognized that this was one of those moments that would be hard to return to clearly. Later, she would remember it. But memory softens edges and adds significance, and the actual truth of it was simpler and more awkward and more real than memory would make it. He was a man who had been wrong, and was trying to correct it in the specific limited ways available to him, and he was doing it without making her watch him be noble about it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and got up to hang his coat. Saturday morning at the well was not dramatic. Elsie had expected something more formal, and perhaps that was her mistake. She had imagined something more like a public meeting, a defined moment, speech. What happened was more like weather. Gideon Pike happened to be at the well when a group of 7 or 8 people were there, drawing water, and he set his bucket down and said what he had to say in the direct, unadorned way that characterized everything he said, without preamble or performance. He said that his children had been fed by Elsie's knowledge for 6 weeks. He said that his youngest was healthier than he'd been in 2 years. He said that he had attended her sessions himself, had seen the documentation, had asked hard questions and received honest answers. He said that the list that was circulating around the settlement was not what it claimed to be, that he had spoken to 3 of the families whose children appeared on it, and that none of them had connected their child's minor ailments to Elsie's preparations until someone had suggested the connection to them. He said that Mabel Whitcomb had a chest cough because it was winter and she was 81, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was either ignorant of the facts or choosing to ignore them. He said one more thing, and this was the thing that traveled farthest afterward, that showed up in several people's retellings, with the closest fidelity to how he actually said it. I don't know what Beatrice Crow's reasons are for what she's doing, but I know what Elsie Hartwell's reasons are. She's kept us from going hungry. That's the whole of it. He picked up his bucket and left. Nobody argued with him. The people who had been at the well that morning dispersed in the way that people disperse after something significant has happened, not rushing, not chattering, but moving with a kind of careful quietness of people who are going to think about what they just heard before they say anything about it. By that afternoon, it was the most discussed thing in Ash Creek. Elsie heard about it from Hannah, who had heard it from Rosie, who had been at the well drawing water for the morning washing, and had watched the whole thing with her quick eyes, and then run home to tell her mother. She said Gideon looked like a man who had decided something, Hannah said. She said it wasn't angry, just settled. That's Gideon, Elsie said. People are listening. Hannah was watching her face carefully. You know what this means for Beatrice? Yes. How do you feel about that? Elsie considered the question. It was an honest question, from someone who knew her well enough to ask it, and it deserved an honest answer. I feel like it needed to happen, she said. I don't feel good about it. I don't feel bad about it. It's just true. It needed to happen. She's going to come to you, Hannah said. Eventually. She's going to have to. I know. What are you going to say? Elsie didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the creek, which she could see from here as a dark line through the pale, dry grass, moving the way it always moved, regardless of what was happening on the banks around it. I don't know yet, she said. I'll know when she's here. Beatrice came on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after Gideon spoke at the well. She came alone, without Thomas, without any of the women she usually moved with, and she came after dark, which meant she had waited until she could be reasonably sure she wouldn't be observed. Elsie was still up when she heard the knock. Jonah had gone to bed. The fire was lower than it had been, and the knock was tentative in a way that Beatrice's presence never usually was. Elsie opened the door. Beatrice was standing in the cold with her coat pulled tight and an expression that Elsie's had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone who has been rehearsing something and has just realized on arrival that the rehearsal isn't going to hold. They looked at each other for a moment through the open door. Come in, Elsie said. Beatrice came in. She stood in the kitchen and didn't sit, and she looked around the room at the drying frames, and the jars on the shelf, and the journals on the table, and the residue of the day's work, with the look of someone seeing something they've argued against, for so long that actually being inside it is disorienting. I have some things to say, Beatrice said. All right. I want to say them without you interrupting, if you can manage it. Elsie sat down. I can manage it. Beatrice stood a little straighter. She had the bearing of someone who has prepared for this by deciding they were going to do it correctly, and the decision itself was keeping her upright. The rumor about Caleb, she said. I didn't invent the boy's illness. He was sick, that was real. She stopped, pressed her mouth together. I knew the timing was wrong. I had heard you enough, over the weeks, talking about how plant reactions work, and I knew 8 days was too long. I knew that when I started talking. She looked directly at Elsie, which was clearly costing her something. I knew it, and I did it anyway, because I needed. She stopped again. Elsie waited. I needed you to be wrong, Beatrice said. About something, about anything. She let out a slow breath. I had said so many things about you for so long. About the weeds, and the time you wasted, and what it meant about your judgment. And then the beetles came, and none of it was true, and you were the one keeping people alive. And I was, she made a short, sharp gesture that had no clean translation. I was the one who'd been wrong. About all of it. For years. Elsie said nothing. That list, Beatrice continued. I didn't write it. I won't say I had nothing to do with it, because she stopped. I had something to do with it. I was talking to people, and some of those conversations became that list, and I knew it was being made, and I didn't stop it. Silence. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, Beatrice said. The rehearsed quality was almost entirely gone now. This part, Elsie thought, she was saying for the first time to anyone. I don't think I'm owed that. I'm here because Gideon Pike said something at the well that I couldn't argue with, and because I've been watching what you've been doing, and I can't keep pretending I think it's wrong. She looked at her hands. I don't know what I'm asking for. Elsie looked at her for a long moment. Beatrice Crowe was not a simple woman, and she had done real harm, and the harm was not going to be resolved in a single conversation in a kitchen late on a Tuesday night. Elsie was not going to pretend otherwise, was not going to wrap this in a comfort that it didn't deserve. But she also recognized something in the woman standing across her kitchen, not repentance exactly, which was too clean a word for what this was. Something rawer and more resistant. The particular discomfort of a person who has looked at their own behavior honestly and found it worse than they'd been willing to admit before. The past is fixed, Elsie said. I can't change it, and you can't change it. But there are 20 families in this settlement who are going into winter short on food and long on fear, and if you spent the next 3 months continuing to fight what I'm doing, some of those families might not make it to spring in the same shape they should. She looked at Beatrice steadily. So here's what I'm saying. The past is what it is. What matters now is what comes next. Beatrice was very still. I'm not asking you to come to the sessions, Elsie said. I'm not asking you to make a public statement or explain yourself to anyone. I'm telling you that the work is still here and it needs doing, and there is room in it for anyone who wants to be useful. She paused. That's all I have to offer you. Beatrice stood there for another moment. Her face was working through something that had too many components to read simply. Then she nodded once slowly. She put her coat back on. Picked up the cloth she'd come in with. She'd had a cloth folded over her arm the whole time, which Elsie had been aware of, but hadn't mentioned, and set it on the table. It was heavy and smelled of rose chips. From my fence line, Beatrice said without looking up. I picked them last week. I didn't know what to do with them. She left. Elsie stood at the closed door for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the cloth of rose chips on her table, picked up the cloth and opened it, and looked at what was inside a careful harvest, properly sorted, better than she would have expected. She set it down and sat at the table and sat with the quiet for a while. Outside, the creek moved in the dark the way it always moved. The settlement was cold and still around it. Somewhere in his bed, Jonah was sleeping the deep sleep of a man who had spent the day working with his hands, and somewhere in her own house, Beatrice Crowe was sitting with whatever she was sitting with, and somewhere across the settlement, 7 families were going to sleep with food in their stores that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. It was not resolution. It was not the end of anything. But something had shifted, the way the ground shifts when water finds a new course, through it not dramatically, not all at once, but in a direction that would be visible in time to anyone paying attention. And Elsie Hartwell, who had been paying attention to things longer than anyone in Ash Creek had given her credit for, felt the shift and recognized it for what it was. Not victory, not peace, just the hard, specific, ordinary work of things beginning to change. The rose ships sat on Elsie's table through the night and into the next morning, and she did not process them right away, which was unusual for her. She was not a person who let things sit when there was work to be done with them. But she left the cloth where Beatrice had set it and went about her morning, and when Jonah came into the kitchen and raised an eyebrow at the unfamiliar bundle, she told him simply that someone had brought a harvest and she'd get to it later. He didn't ask who. She appreciated that. What she was doing, though she didn't name it to herself in those terms, was giving herself time to set down what had happened the night before in a way that let her see it clearly rather than through the distortion of the moment. She had learned this about herself, that she needed a certain interval between an event and her interpretation of it, or she would interpret it through the emotions that were still too close, and that interpretation would be either too generous or too hard, depending on which emotion was sitting on top. By the time she processed the rose ships on Wednesday afternoon, she had reached a position that she thought was approximately accurate. Beatrice's visit had been real. The admission had been real. The rose ships were real. None of that meant the situation was resolved, because resolution was a long road, and the woman had been at her kitchen door for less than 20 minutes. But the visit itself was a fact, and facts were what Elsie built on. And this particular fact was more significant than it might have appeared from the outside. She wrote it down in the journal. Date, visitor, content of conversation, her own assessment. Closed the journal and put it on the shelf and got to work. The change in the community over the following 2 weeks did not announce itself. It happened in the way of most real changes, not in proclamations or dramatic reversals, but in the accumulation of small shifts that individually seemed unremarkable and together constituted something new. The families that had pulled back returned, most of them. Not all at once, and not without the residue of the awkward weeks still visible in how they entered the kitchen and whether they met Elsie's eyes at the start. But they came. Aldous Green came on a Thursday with his wife, which surprised Elsie because she had not expected him, and she had particularly not expected his wife, who was a woman of fixed opinions that she held with remarkable consistency, regardless of what the evidence suggested. They sat at the table and asked careful questions, and took home 2 jars of dried lamb's quarters and a piece of paper on which Elsie had written at the wife's careful request the preparation method for nettle broth in handwriting slow enough to be legible. Gerald Aldous came on a different Thursday alone and spent 3 hours working through the cattail flour preparation without being asked to stay. He was methodical and precise in a way that made Elsie revise her initial assessment of him. She had first read him as a man who led from instinct, and he was that. But underneath the instinct was a careful attention to process that expressed itself differently from hers, but arrived at similar places. He burned his first batch and said something under his breath that was not appropriate to his informal calling, and Elsie did not respond, because some moments were private, regardless of whether someone else was standing nearby. What he produced by the third attempt was imperfect but edible, and he looked at it the way a person looks at something they've made with difficulty and come to terms with. "You've been doing this for years," he said. "The learning part, yes. Get easier?" "Some of it. The identification gets easier, because you've seen the plants in so many conditions that recognition becomes faster. Cooking part," she considered. "Some things become habit. Other things are hard every time, because the conditions are always a little different, and you have to adjust." He nodded slowly. "That's true of most things worth doing," he said. She didn't disagree. Caleb Pierce came back to the creek on the first Saturday, after he was fully recovered, as he'd said he would. And he came early, before the frost had fully lifted from the grass, with his coat buttoned to the chin, and his map and his charcoal pencil, and a list of questions written in a hand that was cramped with the particular energy of someone who has been lying in bed, thinking for 2 weeks, and has had more time to generate questions than usual. He handed Elsie the list at the gate. She read through it, counted them, looked up at him. 17 questions, she said. "I had more, but I thought some of them were probably too basic to write down." She looked at the list again. Several of the questions were not basic. One in particular about how she could tell the difference between a plant that was edible in one season and toxic in another, and whether there was a reliable physical marker for the transition, was the kind of question that people with years of botanical study sometimes couldn't answer precisely. "Where did you get this one?" she said, pointing. "I found an old plant pamphlet in my father's trunk. From before we came to Ash Creek. It said some plants changed between seasons, but it didn't explain how to identify the change." He looked at the question. It seemed important. "It is important," she said. "Come on." They walked to the creek and she answered his questions one at a time. Not quickly, not efficiently, but in the way that mattered thoroughly, with the specific details that the general answer needed to be actually useful. Caleb listened in the way that he always listened, with his full attention, and without performing understanding he didn't have. When something wasn't clear, he said so, and when something was clear, he moved on without dwelling, which was a discipline that many adults hadn't managed. Question about seasonal toxicity took 40 minutes. She explained the physical markers as clearly as she could, changes in leaf color, texture, the chemistry you could sometimes smell, the visible responses of the plant to temperature and light. She explained that it wasn't a perfect system and that some of the knowledge had come from errors, from eating things at the wrong time and noting the result in the journal and never doing it again. "You made yourself sick," Caleb said a few times. "Nothing serious, but yes, on purpose, not exactly on purpose. More that I was testing in small enough quantities that I knew it wouldn't be serious, but I was still testing." She looked at the plant in her hand. "You learn fastest from what goes wrong." "That's true in the creek, and it's probably true everywhere." He wrote something in his own notebook. She noticed he'd gotten a proper one since she'd last seen him, not a piece of folded paper, but an actual bound notebook, the kind sold at the general store with his name written on the inside cover. "Did you buy that?" she said. "My mother did." He said it without embarrassment, though she could tell it was something he felt something, about a small, uncomplicated pride that he didn't want to make too much of. She said I should have somewhere to put the work. Elsie looked at the notebook, and then at him. She's right, she said simply, and moved on to the next question. It was Gideon who brought it to Elsie's attention that the shift had reached a certain point. Came by on a weekday afternoon, not for a session, just because he was passing and had something to say. And Gideon Pike was the kind of man who said things when he had them and not before. He stood in her yard rather than coming inside, because as that also characteristic of him, he had limits on how far into someone else's domestic space he was comfortable going without specific invitation. There's talk, he said. About what? About the spring, he said. About what people are going to do differently in the spring. With the planting, he had his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, which was how he looked when he was working through something while simultaneously reporting it. Some of the men were talking yesterday about whether to put in more variety, less of any single crop. Harder to lose everything at once if something like the beetles comes again. Elsie looked at him. That makes sense. It's not a small change, he said. It means different planning and different work and different expectations for what you'll produce. He paused. They're thinking about it because of this. Because of watching one crop type get wiped out. He glanced at her. Because of what you've been teaching. She didn't say anything for a moment. Some of them won't say it that way, Gideon continued. Some of them will say they figured it out themselves, or that it's just common sense. That's how men are. He said it without much edge. It was an observation rather than a complaint. But you and I both know what moved the idea into the room. Does it matter who gets the credit? She said. If they plant the right way? Thought about it. Probably not, he said to the plants. To the plants, she agreed. He left, and she stood in the yard for a while in the cold, not doing anything in particular, just standing with what he'd said. The idea that her work was spreading laterally, not just through the sessions she ran, and the people who attended them, but through conversations she wasn't part of, and decisions she wasn't present for, was something she had hoped for without being confident of. It was the way she'd always imagined it would need to work, if it was going to work at all. You couldn't teach everyone yourself. You couldn't be everywhere. The knowledge had to get loose and move on its own, had to become something the community carried, rather than something one person carried for the community. It was moving, imperfectly, unevenly, in ways she couldn't control and didn't always know about. But it was moving. The morning Beatrice Crow appeared at the Tuesday session. Nobody said anything. That was the thing Elsie remembered most clearly afterward, not what Beatrice said, or how she held herself, or what Elsie said in response, but the particular silence of the room when Beatrice walked in. There were 9 people in the kitchen that morning. Every single one of them registered Beatrice's arrival in their own way. A pause, a slight shift, a glance at Elsie or at the door, and every single one of them decided, apparently simultaneously and without coordination, to say nothing about it. Beatrice stood in the doorway for a moment. She was carrying a cloth bag. She had dressed, Elsie noticed, practically not in her better clothes, not in anything that announced itself, but in the kind of thing you wore when you expected to work. There's room at the table, Elsie said. Beatrice came in and sat at the far end, and Elsie continued what she'd been explaining before the door opened: the process of pressing dried plants to remove moisture before long-term storage, which was a detail that many people skipped and that cost them in the quality of what they had by January. She did not treat Beatrice differently from anyone else. She answered her questions when she had them, which were cautious and practical. She did not call attention to her presence or her absence from previous sessions. She ran the session the way she always ran it, which was the only thing she knew how to do, and the only thing that would have served. Hannah caught Elsie's eye at one point across the table. Her expression said something that didn't require words. Elsie gave a small nod and looked back at what she was doing. Afterward, when most of the others had gone, Beatrice stayed to help clean up. She did it without asking, just began stacking jars and clearing the table. And the 3 women, Elsie, Hannah, Beatrice, worked in the kitchen, in a silence that was not comfortable, exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of people who are in the same room, doing the same work, which is its own kind of beginning. When the kitchen was clear, Beatrice picked up her bag. Same time Thursday, she asked. Same time Thursday, Elsie said. Beatrice left. Hannah waited until the sound of footsteps on the porch was gone, and then she sat down at the table and exhaled in a way that she'd clearly been holding back for about an hour. Well, she said. Well, Elsie said. How do you feel? Ask me in a month, Elsie said, when I know whether it holds. Hannah looked at her. You don't trust it. I trust what I can see over time. One session is one session. Elsie picked up the journal from the table. She worked hard this morning. She asked the right questions. Stayed to clean up. She paused. That's something. I'll see what is in a month. What Elsie did not see, because it happened in places she wasn't, and in conversations she wasn't part of, was the effect of Beatrice's attendance on the people who had been watching Beatrice. Betrayal was a social fact in Ash Creek. Whatever she did, people noticed. Whatever position she held, people oriented toward it, the way you orient toward a fixed point in unfamiliar terrain. She had built that position over years, and it held even after the weeks of damage the Caleb situation had done to it. Because social positions of that kind don't collapse from a single incident, they erode, gradually, and Beatrice's had been eroding, but it had not collapsed. When Beatrice walked into Elsie's kitchen and sat down and worked, people knew about it by the next morning. Not because Beatrice announced it, she didn't, but because Ash Creek was small, and nothing was invisible in a place that size, and several of the people who'd been in that kitchen had family members or neighbors who asked them about their morning. The effect was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing anyone made a speech about. But in the following week, 3 families who had been on the fence, who had been watching the situation with the particular engine of people who were trying to decide which way to land, sent someone to Elsie's door. Elsie noted this without drawing too direct a line between it and Beatrice's attendance. Correlation was clear enough. She wasn't going to argue with the result. The hard cold came in the second week of November, earlier than anyone wanted. It announced itself with a drop in temperature that went from manageable to serious over about 36 hours, the kind of cold that found every gap in a wall and every weakness in a roof and made itself known through all of them simultaneously. The creek, which had been moving sluggishly in the warmer weeks of the fall, developed a skin of ice along its edges that was thin enough to break with a boot heel, but was there every morning when Elsie went out and thicker each day than the day before. The timing was bad in the way that weather timing is always bad, not catastrophic, not the worst imaginable, but precisely inconvenient enough to put real pressure on the work still needing to be done. There were families who had not yet finished building their winter food stores. There were plants that could still have been harvested from the less exposed, south-facing areas along the creek if the temperature had held for another 2 weeks. There were pickling and drying processes that needed warm enough days to work properly and were now running out of them. Elsie worked longer hours. She had always been an early riser, but she began going to the creek before the light was fully up, sometimes in the dark with a lantern, pushing the limits of what the cold allowed. She found that the watercress survived longer than she'd expected in the sheltered spots. The water from the creek's deeper channel kept the temperature around those patches just above freezing in ways the air temperature didn't capture. She harvested everything she could from those spots and brought it home and processed it the same day. Jonah helped more than he'd ever helped before. This was a shift that had been gradual enough that she hadn't noticed it was happening until she noticed it was complete. He had gone from the man who worried about what people said to the man who apologized at the creek, to the man who went to Gideon Pike without being asked, to this, a man who showed up in the pre-dawn kitchen and put his coat on and asked where he was needed. No announcement, no speech about it, just present in the way that useful people are present. He was not skilled at the botanical work, and he didn't pretend to be. He was skilled at everything around it, the carrying, the building, the fixing of the drying frames when they got wet and warped, the negotiating of the temperature inside the barn, where most of the drying happened, now that the kitchen was too cold in the mornings. He knew how to manage wood and fire, and the particular thermal logic of enclosed spaces, which was its own kind of knowledge that Elsie didn't have and didn't pretend to. They worked alongside each other in those early weeks of cold, in a way they hadn't before the beetles came, with a kind of collaborative efficiency that was different from the parallel lives they'd lived him in the field, her at the creek, and different from the strained negotiations about public opinion that had characterized too many of their evenings. This was cleaner, quieter, built around a shared purpose that didn't require explanation. One morning, working side by side at the barn, he said, "Do you think we'll have enough?" She didn't answer immediately. She was sorting through a batch of dried nettles, feeling for moisture, separating the ones that needed more time from the ones that were ready to store. "For us," she said finally, "yes. For everyone, I don't know. I think most families will make it. I think there are 2 or 3 who are still short and who are going to need what we can give directly." She set aside a handful of the questionable batch. "I've been thinking about who." "Tell me," he said. Did. She laid out, methodically, What she knew about each family's current food situation, not in a gossiping way, but in the way she laid out plant information, with specifics and practical implications. He listened and asked clarifying questions, practical ones, and by the end of it they had worked out a distribution plan that neither of them had to name as such, because it was just the next step of the work. "The greenways," he said. "I'll talk to Marcus. He won't ask for help, but if I offer in the right way, he'll take it," she said. "If you make it not feel like charity." "I know how to talk to Marcus Greenway," Jonah said, with the slight edge of a man who has spent enough years in community to know its social mechanics. "Leave that one to me." She left it to him. The week the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, Rosie Pike showed up at the door with a problem. She was 13 and generally handled her own problems, so the fact of her coming to Elsie with this one, rather than to her mother, told Elsie something before Rosie had said a word. She came in and sat down and put her notebook on the table. She had been keeping the notebook for 8 weeks now, and it had grown substantial. She opened it to a specific page. "I found something," she said. "Creek in the section past the Aldous fence line, the part I haven't been to before. I drew it. I think I know what it is, but I'm not certain." Turned the notebook to show Elsie. The drawing was detailed and careful, with measurements noted in the margin stem diameter, leaf width, the distance between leaf nodes. Plant it showed was a large-leafed thing with a thick stem that grew in the partially sheltered spot along the bank, and Rosie had noted in her small handwriting that it was still green despite the recent cold. Elsie looked at the drawing for a long time. "Did you touch it?" she said. "I touched the leaves, not the stem. Did you taste it?" "No, I knew I shouldn't without checking first." Elsie looked up. "That's the right choice." She looked back at the drawing. "What do you think it is?" "I think it might be wild comfrey. But the leaf shape is a little different from your journal drawings. And I wasn't sure if that was because of the season or because it's something else." Elsie stood up. "Come with me." They went to the creek, both of them in their heaviest coats, and Elsie examined the plant directly kneeling beside it in the half-frozen mud, feeling the texture of the stem and the underside of the leaves, bending a small branch and observing the break, smelling the sap. It was not wild comfrey. It was something rarer and, in certain specific preparations, more useful, a plant she had documented in her third journal and had not expected to find this far west, one that her grandmother had called by a different name, and that the botanical pamphlets described in cautious terms because of the precise conditions required for safe use. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. "I need to look at the third journal when we get back," she said. "But Rosie, this is a significant find." Rosie was crouched beside her, looking at the plant with an expression of concentrated seriousness. "Is it useful?" "Potentially very useful, but it's also the kind of thing you need to know exactly what you're doing with before you use it." Elsie stood. "That's the second important lesson you've shown me you understand this morning." Rosie looked at her. "You found something you didn't recognize. You documented it carefully. You didn't touch it more than necessary. You didn't taste it. You came to someone who might know more." Elsie looked at the plant once more. "That's the whole method right there. Most people skip at least 2 of those steps." Rosie looked back at the plant with something that was not quite pride, but was its close neighbor. "Can I help with the research?" she asked. "You've already started it," Elsie said. "The drawing is the beginning. The day Caleb's map became useful was the day the Green family's youngest child disappeared. She was 6, a girl named Bet, and she had gone out in the morning to bring water from the well and had not come back, and by the time anyone realized it had been more than 20 minutes. 2 hours had passed, and the cold was serious, and the settlement was organized in the rapid, frightened way of communities that have dealt with lost children before and know what it costs to be slow. Jonah went out with Marcus Greenway and 2 other men. Elsie stayed at the house because she was the one with the map. Not her map, Caleb's map. The one he had made of the land around the settlement, marking every plant he'd found, which meant marking every corner of the land he'd walked. He had updated it 3 times since the first version, each time extending its range and adding detail, and the current version covered more territory than anyone had formally mapped. She spread it on the table and looked at it. A 6-year-old with a bucket going to the well. The well was southeast of the greenhouse. If the child had gone off course, if she'd seen something, if she'd gotten turned around in the cold, the most likely directions were north toward the creek or east toward the stand of dense brush that grew between the settlement and the open land beyond. She studied the map for 10 minutes. Then she sent Rosie, who was at the house for the morning's work, running to find Jonah with a message about the east brush stand, and specifically the low area between the two fence lines where the ground stayed wetter and softer and might not have frozen solid yet, which meant a small child could sink. Jonah found Bet Green in that exact area 40 minutes later, cold and frightened but unharmed, having followed a rabbit she'd seen and then gotten confused about which direction was home. She was returned to her mother, who wrapped her in everything available and stood on her porch, shaking for about 10 minutes before composing herself. Marcus Greenway came to Elsie's door that evening. He was a man who said little, and when he said things, he said them directly. Stood on her porch and looked at her and said, "Caleb Pierce's map." "Caleb Pierce's map," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "I would like my son to learn what Caleb knows, if that's something you'd allow." "Caleb is the one to ask," Elsie said. "He knows more about the mapping side of it than I do now. But bring your son to the creek Saturday morning, and we'll both be there." Marcus nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it to the middle distance rather than to her, which was how Marcus Greenway did things, and she understood that this was as direct as it was going to get. "For the letter business. I didn't write anything, but I listened to things I shouldn't have, and repeated some of them." "I know," she said. "I'm not good at this part," he said. "You came here," she said. "That's the hardest part." He left. Gideon Pike, at the following Saturday session, did something that Elsie had not anticipated. He brought 3 other men with him. Not his neighbors, not people who'd been part of the gradual return of the community. 3 farmers from the eastern part of the settlement's range, men who were not, strictly speaking, in the social orbit that Elsie's sessions had been pulling from. Men who had heard about what was happening from enough lateral sources that they'd started forming their own opinions, and who apparently shared the quality that Gideon had of preferring to see things themselves rather than rely entirely on what other people said about them. Their names were Henry Marshdore's father-in-law, which was its own interesting detail, Cyrus Abbott, and a man who went simply by Walt, who was somewhere in his 60s and had lived in the valley almost as long as Mabel Whitcomb. Walt was the one who gave Elsie the most careful attention. He sat at the table and watched everything she did with the particular focus of someone who is comparing what they're seeing against a mental inventory of what they already know, which was a different kind of attention from the ignorance, filling attention of someone new to the information. Several times he nodded slowly in ways that suggested recognition rather than novelty. After the session, when most of the others were dispersing, he stopped her. "My wife's people were from further south," he said. "Before we came here, she knew some of this." Elsie looked at him. "Not all of it. Different plants, different country. The same kind of thing." He looked at the jars on the shelf. "She died 12 years ago. I always thought her knowledge died with her." He paused. "I've been thinking about whether I remember more of it than I believed." "Write down what you remember," Elsie said. "Whatever you have, even partial. Especially the preparation methods, because those are the hardest things to reconstruct." He considered this. "You'd find it useful? Even if I'm not certain of all of it, I'll tell you what holds up and what needs verifying. But I'd rather have something uncertain than have it lost entirely." He nodded. He picked up his coat from the chair. "I'll come back Thursday," he said, "with what I have." The shift in the community was not invisible to the people who had opposed what Elsie was doing, and it created its own complications. Not from Beatrice, who was attending sessions twice a week and working quietly and had not, so far as Elsie could tell, said anything publicly either way, which was, for Beatrice, a form of statement in itself. But from the edges of the situation, from people who had attached themselves to the opposition, without fully understanding what they were opposing, who now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of a losing side that hadn't been given a clear signal that the fight was over. 2 women came to Elsie's door on a Wednesday who had not been to any session, and had not, as far as Elsie knew, been involved in the letter campaign. They were nervous in the way that people are nervous when they want something, but are not sure they're entitled to ask for it. They wanted to know if it was too late to learn. Elsie looked at them for a moment. One of them, a woman named Pearl, whose husband had been one of the men loudest in his skepticism in the early weeks, was not quite meeting her eyes. The other, younger, was, "Come in," Elsie said. "Sessions are Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Come in now and I'll start with the basics." Pearl exhaled. "We weren't kind," she said before. "I want to say that." "All right," Elsie said. "That's all? That's enough for now." Elsie moved toward the kitchen. "Come on. I'll show you the drying frames first. That's where most people make their first mistake, and it's the easiest to correct." They followed her. By the end of the 6th week, The sessions had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, less like crisis management and more like something durable. Tuesdays and Thursdays, mornings, 8 to 12 people most weeks, rotating through as schedules allowed. Content had deepened because the foundational knowledge was now widespread enough that Elsie could move past the basics into more specific and nuanced territory, the management of particular plants across seasons, the integration of wild foods with whatever stored garden produce families still had, the construction of a more diverse and resilient food practice for the following spring. Caleb's map had been copied 3 times by other people. His original was in his own notebook, supplemented and updated weekly, and it was now 30% larger in coverage than the first version. He and Rosie, who had developed a working relationship of the specific and slightly adversarial kind that characterizes genuine intellectual collaboration between people who are both very confident in their own observations, had begun a joint record of plant locations and seasonal changes that was, Elsie thought, going to be more comprehensive than anything she'd managed on her own. Walt had come back on Thursday as promised, with 3 pages of his wife's knowledge written out in an old man's careful handwriting, and it was more than Elsie had hoped for. Some of it was familiar, some of it was from plant traditions she didn't know well, and one section described a preparation method she had never seen but that, when she thought it through, made chemical sense. She spent 2 evenings working through it and wrote her own response notes in the margins and returned it to him with a request for anything more he could remember. He came back the following Tuesday with 2 more pages. Jonah came home from the feed store on a cold afternoon in late November with a particular look on his face that Elsie recognized from the way he carried his shoulders, the look of a man who has heard something significant and is deciding how to present it. She waited while he took his coat off and sat down. 2 of the men were talking today, he said, about a letter that went to the County Agricultural Society. From someone in Ash Creek. Elsie looked at him. What kind of letter? About what you've been doing, about the wild plant lessons, and how the settlement has been managing since the beetle swarm. He looked at his hands. Society is apparently interested. There might be an inquiry. Someone coming out to look at what's been happening here. Elsie was quiet. I don't know who sent the letter, Jonah said. Nobody does, or if they do, they're not saying. But it's out there. She thought about this for a moment. An outside inquiry could mean many things. It could mean scrutiny, which brought its own complications. It could mean resources or acknowledgement or the kind of official attention that sometimes helped and sometimes made things more complicated than they'd been without it. How do people feel about it? She asked. Mixed, he said honestly. Some are glad. Some are worried about outsiders telling them what they should have done differently. He paused. Gideon said, if someone comes out here, they'd better plan to listen before they talk. That's fair, she said. She picked up her journal. She was almost through the 4th one and had already started a 5th, a new one, purchased at the general store in a moment that she hadn't been able to explain to the clerk was more significant than buying a notebook usually was. The 5th journal represented something the previous 4 hadn't, which was not survival knowledge, but something longer-sighted than that. Observations about what was growing, yes, but also observations about what was changing in the land and in the people moving across it. She turned to a blank page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, someone sent a letter to the county. Paused, then added, the work has traveled farther than the room. She put down the pen and looked at what she'd written and thought it was as accurate a description of the moment as she could manage. Outside the settlement was settling into its cold early dark, fires being built up in houses across the creek's range, children being brought in from the cold, food being put on tables that 6 weeks ago had seemed dangerously bare. It was not enough, and it was not certain, and the winter was not finished making its demands. But the knowledge was out. It was in notebooks, and in kitchens, and in the hands of a 13-year-old girl who drew plants the way a painter draws faces, and in the memory of an old man whose wife had known things nobody else had written down, and in the questions of an 11-year-old who had mapped more of the land than any adult in the settlement and was not done yet. You couldn't put it back. And somewhere, in a county seat she'd never visited, in an office she'd never been in, someone had read a letter about a woman in Ash Creek who had spent 4 years crouching in creek mud while people laughed and had found it significant enough to write down and send forward. She didn't know what that meant yet. She knew what the work meant, that she was certain of. The rest she would see when it arrived. The letter from the County Agricultural Society arrived on a Tuesday, which was a session day, and Elsie did not open it until the last person had left, and the kitchen was cleaned, and the jars were back on their shelves. She had seen the envelope on the table when people were arriving that morning and had put it to one side without comment, because the session mattered more than the letter, and because she had learned over the years that important things could wait better than people could. The work was in the room. The letter would be what it was regardless of when she read it. Jonah was at the table when she finally picked it up. He didn't say anything, just looked at her, and she understood that he had been aware of the envelope all morning too, and had also chosen to wait. She opened it. The letter was from a man named Edmund Ferris, who gave his title as the Secretary of the County Agricultural Society, and whose handwriting was precise and slightly formal in the way of someone who has written many official letters and has developed a style that keeps emotion at a professional distance. He wrote that the society had received a detailed account of the events in Ash Creek following the beetle swarm of the previous fall, including a description of the wild plant identification and preparation program that had been established by a resident of the settlement. He wrote that the society was interested in understanding this program more fully, as it represented a practical response to agricultural crisis that had significant implications for other settlements in the county that remained vulnerable to similar events. He wrote that if Mrs. Hartwell was willing, the society would welcome her presence at their spring gathering, at which she might speak to the assembled members about what she had done and how she had done it. He wrote, at the end, in a sentence that was slightly less formal than the rest of the letter, and that Elsie read 3 times, "We are aware that the circumstances under which you developed this knowledge were not easy, and we do not take lightly the invitation we are extending." She put the letter down. Jonah picked it up and read it. He was a slow reader, but a thorough one, and when he was done, he set it back on the table and looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Are you going to go?" She had been asking herself this question since she'd read the first paragraph and had not yet arrived at a clean answer. Question had layers. The obvious one was whether she wanted the recognition, and she was honest enough to admit that. She was a human being who had been dismissed and mocked and had anonymous letters slid under her door, and the idea of standing before a room of people who took her seriously was not without appeal. But underneath that was a more complicated question, which was about what the recognition was for and what it would cost in the going, and whether she was the person who should be carrying this knowledge out into the wider world, or whether the knowledge was better served by staying where it was and continuing to root. She thought about Mabel Whitcomb, who was still alive and still sharp and still eating lamb's quarters soup once a week. She thought about Caleb's map, which now covered a territory that no single person could have walked in a week. She thought about Walt's pages of his wife's knowledge, which were now transcribed into Elsie's 5th journal alongside her own notes and cross-references, which meant they were no longer at risk of disappearing with the last person who held them. Thought about Rosie Pike, who had started teaching the younger children from her own notebook on Saturday mornings at the creek, because Elsie had started going out earlier, and there were children who arrived before she was back. She thought about Beatrice Crow, who had come to every session for 6 weeks and had not missed one. "I think I'm going to go," Elsie said. Jonah nodded. It was the nod of a man who had already known what the answer would be, possibly before she did. "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. "If you want me to," he added, in the way that said he'd understood she might need to think about it. "Yes," she said, "I want you to." December arrived, and the winter settled in with the particular commitment of a season that has no intention of being brief. Creek froze completely in the 2nd week, which Elsie had been watching for and had prepared for by doing the final harvests from the sheltered creek sections in the last days of November. She had pushed herself, and anyone who would help her through those final days, with a driven quality that Jonah had learned to read, as the sign of someone working ahead of a deadline they can't negotiate with. He had come with her every morning. So had Hannah. On the last morning, before the hard freeze locked the creek entirely, Caleb Pierce had shown up unasked at the gate before dawn, in the dark, with his coat and his notebook, and a question about the ice margins that turned out to be relevant, and that Elsie's answered, while they both crouched at the creek's edge in the last usable light. They brought in everything there was to bring in. It was not everything she'd hoped for. It was not the ideal. 2 families in the settlement were going to need direct provision from what Elsie and a few others had stored. She had already arranged this with Jonah, and had already arranged the arrangement so that nobody receiving would have to ask in a way that felt like begging. That had been Jonah's contribution to the logistics, the understanding of how certain men received help and what made it possible rather than humiliating. She was grateful for it in a way that was specific and genuine. Fifth journal filled up in December. She started a sixth. Christmas came and went without ceremony, which was typical. For Ash Creek. There was no formal celebration, no community gathering, just families in their own houses eating what they had and staying warm. Elsie cooked the best meal she could from what was available, and she and Jonah sat at the table and ate it without much conversation, because the cold encouraged a specific kind of quiet that they had both come to be comfortable with over the years. But on the day after Christmas, Mabel Whitcomb sent word asking Elsie to come. She went in the early afternoon, with a jar of something warm tucked under her arm. Mabel was in her usual chair, but she looked different from the last several visits, not worse. Exactly. But different in the way that people who are old and have been sick sometimes look when they have come through the far sides of something and are taking stock. The chest cough was gone. Mabel had worked through it on her own timetable the way she did everything, and it had left without doing the damage it might have done to someone whose fundamental constitution was less formidable. Sit, Small said. Elsie sat. They sat together for a while without talking, which was also typical of their time together, and which Elsie had come to value in a way that was hard to describe. Mabel was the oldest person she knew, and the one with the fewest unnecessary words, and in her presence the things that seemed large often reduced themselves to their actual size. The letter from the county, Mabel said. Word travels, Elsie said. In Ash Creek it travels in about 8 hours. Mabel adjusted her blanket. Are you going? In the spring, yes. Mabel looked at her for a moment. You're worried about something. I'm worried I'll go and say the right things and they'll decide they understand it, and they won't. Elsie looked at her hands. I'm worried that the knowledge will get summarized, reduced to something you can say in a speech, and people can nod at and feel like they've understood. She paused. The knowledge isn't a speech. It's years of mornings at the creek. You can't compress that. No, Mabel said, you can't. She looked out the window. But you can give people enough to start. And some of them will start, and some of them won't. And the ones who start will make their own years of mornings. That's how it moves. And the ones who don't will have heard it. And when something happens, when the beetles come, or the drought, or whatever else, they'll remember that they heard it. And someone will start then. Mabel looked back at her. You're not going there to change everyone. You're going there to be the voice they remember when the time comes. Elsie was quiet. Your grandmother would have said the same thing, Mabel said. You didn't know my grandmother. No. But you've told me about her enough that I know what she would have said. Mabel's expression was dry in the particular way that very old people can be dry, with the accumulated patience of someone who has watched many things happen and has reached conclusions that are not sentimental, but are not unkind either. She started with you. You started with a creek and some notebooks. This is just the next generation of the same thing. Elsie looked at her. There were things she wanted to say that she couldn't quite get into words, and she sat with that for a moment, and then let it be what it was. Thank you, she said, for the things you've done this fall. The testimony, the patience with people coming by to ask after you. I didn't do it for you, Mabel said in the same tone that Gideon had used months ago. I did it because it was true and it needed saying. She picked up her cup. That's also doing it for you. Same thing in this case. Elsie recognized her own words coming back to her, and she didn't say anything about it. And from the slight shift in Mabel's expression, she understood that the old woman knew she'd recognize them. January was the hardest month. Not because of disaster, there was no single dramatic collapse, no crisis that arrived with definition and urgency. It was harder than that. It was the sustained grinding pressure of a cold that would not break, of days that were short and dim, and that ran together without distinction, of food that was adequate but not comfortable, of people who were tired in the way that you get tired when you have been careful and watchful for a long time, and the requirement of carefulness has not yet let up. Elsie ran the sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the attendance did not drop. This was the thing she noted most carefully in the sixth journal, not the number of people, but the fact that they kept coming through the worst of the winter when there was no immediate crisis driving them, when it would have been easier to stay home and treat what they already knew as sufficient. They came because the sessions had become something other than emergency response. They had become a practice, the way any regular gathering becomes a practice, not because every individual instance is essential, but because the continuity of it is. Hannah brought Rosie most Tuesdays, and Rosie brought whatever observation she'd made from the previous week, and whatever question it had generated, and the questions were getting more sophisticated in a way that Elsie tracked with the specific pleasure of watching someone learn to ask better rather than just to know more. One Tuesday in mid-January, Rosie asked whether there was a way to predict where new plant populations would establish themselves, rather than just finding them after they'd grown. Elsie looked at her for a moment. "Say more about what you mean." Rosie had her notebook open. She'd drawn a rough map of the creek area, not as detailed as Caleb's, but organized around different information. She'd marked what grew where, and then put arrows indicating what grew nearby, trying to capture the relationship patterns. "I've noticed that the watercress always grows close to the purslane along the east bank, and the lamb's quarters seem to come up where there was disturbed ground the previous year. So I was wondering if you could look at a piece of land and figure out before you walked it what you were likely to find." Elsie looked at the map. Then she reached for the 6th journal and opened it to a section she'd been working on. "I've been building the same thing," she said. "I call it the association patterns. The idea that plants grow in communities the same way people do with neighbors they prefer and conditions they share." She turned the journal so Rosie could see. "What you've drawn here is the beginning of it. The next step is to track it over multiple seasons and see whether the pattern holds or changes." Rosie looked at the journal page and then at her own drawing. "Can we combine them?" Elsie looked at the 13-year-old across the table. "Come Saturday," she said, "we'll start a new record. Yours and mine together." Rosie closed her notebook with a snap that was somehow both professional and deeply 13 years old. Caleb Pierce, that same January, did something that nobody had asked him to do, and that turned out to matter considerably. He went to the families in the settlement who had children between 8 and 12 years old and proposed, in the direct and slightly awkward way of an 11-year-old proposing something he has thought about more carefully than most adults give him credit for, that they teach each other. Not a lesson, not a session. A different thing, a regular Saturday morning walk along the creek where whoever came would show whoever else came what they'd learned and ask questions and look at things together without there necessarily being anyone in charge. He came to Elsie to ask if she'd object. She looked at him, standing in her doorway with his coat and his notebook and the serious face that he'd had since the day his fever broke and he got out of bed and went to walk the land. "Why would I object?" she said. "Because it's your knowledge," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was all right too, Caleb." She looked at him directly. "It became your knowledge the moment you learned it. That's how knowledge works. It's not mine anymore once I've given it away." She paused. "That's the entire point." He nodded. He looked relieved in the way of someone whose fear was that the answer might be no, and who wasn't sure what they'd have done if it was. "Saturday morning," she said. "Early. Take whoever comes." The first Saturday 4 children came. The second Saturday 7. By the fourth Saturday there were 11, ranging from 8 to 14, and Caleb was managing them with the particular mix of seriousness and impatience that characterized his engagement with most things, and Rosie had started coming too, which helped because she could handle the younger ones, and also because she and Caleb argued productively about identification questions in a way that modeled for the younger children that disagreement was part of the process and not a failure. Elsie watched from a distance on the fourth Saturday. She had gone to the creek at her usual early hour, and by the time the children arrived, she had done her own work and was sitting on a log on the far bank, mostly out of sight, watching the group move through the frost-stiff brush on the opposite side. She did not go over. She did not insert herself. She watched Caleb crouch beside a plant and show something to a small boy who was leaning in with his whole body, the way children lean when they're genuinely interested, and she watched Rosie on the other side of the group, with 2 girls examining something in the ice at the creek's edge, and she sat with the specific feeling of a person watching something work without them. It was not a comfortable feeling exactly. There was something in it that was loss, the loss of being the necessary one, the one everything flowed through. She recognized this in herself without judgment, because it was a human feeling and she was human, and the honest thing to do with it was to name it and then set it down. What replaced it, sitting in the cold on that log, was something she hadn't had a word for until she had a daughter, or a student, or whatever the word was for Caleb and Rosie, and the children learning from them. It was the particular satisfaction of having made yourself unnecessary, of having done the work so well, for long enough, that it continued without you. Her grandmother had felt this, she thought, when Elsie had walked away from her at 14 with a head full of plant knowledge and a habit of looking carefully at the ground. She walked home when she was ready and wrote it in the 6th journal, not as observation, but as something rarer as understanding. February brought a thaw that was not real, the kind that shows up for a week and tricks you into thinking the worst is over, and then withdraws, taking the warmth with it, and leaving the cold feeling worse for the contrast. But within that false thaw, there was a week of days mild enough to get outside more than they'd been able to, and Elsie used it. She organized one more major session, not in the kitchen but outside, on the cleared ground near the creek, something she'd been planning since December. She wanted people to walk the land together, not individually, not in the separate way they'd been going to the creek all season, but as a group, in the kind of collective attention that she had learned generated different things than private observation. 15 people came. This was more than she'd expected, and she said so. And Hannah, who was standing next to her when they gathered, said quietly, nobody wanted to miss it. They walked the creek for 2 hours. Elsie talked about what was there and what wasn't and why, about the relationship between the frozen ground and what survived in it and what would come up when the ground softened. Talked about what to expect in the spring and what to look for early, what the first signs of the season's plants would be, and which ones came up before it felt like spring, and why you had to know those ones specifically. Walt was there. He had brought his pages, and the subsequent additions, 4 more pages by February, drawn from a memory that turned out to be better than he'd believed, supplemented by 2 letters he'd written to his wife's surviving sister in another state who had added her own contributions. He walked beside Elsie and occasionally said things that added to what she was saying rather than correcting it with the collaborative ease of someone who has found a conversation they fit into. Beatrice was there. She had come every session and had said very little in them, had worked, had listened, had asked practical questions. She was not the same person she had been in the fall, and she was not a different person. She was a person in the middle of changing, which is the least comfortable place to be, and the most human. And Elsie had watched it without comment and without pressure. The changing was Beatrice's business. The sessions were the sessions. On the walk, Beatrice fell into step beside Elsie at one point and was quiet for a moment, and then said, I have a south-facing wall on my property. Gets more sun than most of the creek bank. I've been thinking about what could grow there. Elsie looked at her. What's the soil like? I don't know, Beatrice said. I've never paid attention. Come Saturday morning, Elsie said. We'll look at it. They walked on, side by side, in the cold, and what was between them was not resolved, and was not simple, and was not going to be either of those things for some time. But it was real, and it was moving, which was the most that could be said for anything worth having. Spring came to Ash Creek the way it always came, not all at once, not cleanly, but in a series of advances and retreats that required patience and close attention to tell genuine warming from the false kind. Elsie felt it first in the creek. The ice along the edges began to lose its grip before the air temperature would have suggested it should, which was a sign she recognized from her journals, the deeper channel keeping its movement beneath even a solid-looking surface, the current doing its slow, quiet work. She watched the watercress sections daily, and when the first green appeared in the most sheltered of the south-facing patches, she wrote the date in the journal and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't realized was still locked. Within 2 weeks, the creek bank looked different from a distance, still pale and winter-stripped, but with the beginning of green at the margins that told anyone who knew how to read it that what was coming was already on its way. The Saturday walks resumed. Then the Tuesday and Thursday sessions, which had continued indoors all winter, moved back outside. The group that came was larger than the fall group had been, which Elsie noticed and documented and did not make a speech about, because making a speech about it would have made it smaller in a way she couldn't explain, but was certain of. Spring planting that year looked different. Gideon had talked about this in November, the conversations the men were having about variety and distribution of risk. It had translated into actual changes, smaller blocks of any single crop, more variety across the fields, a more deliberate integration of the kinds of ground cover and fence row plants that Elsie had documented as useful, rather than the clearing of them that had been the previous habit. Not every farmer changed. Several made exactly the same planting decisions they always had, for reasons that were about their own knowledge and comfort and resources, and Elsie did not judge this and did not try to change it, because the decision about what to plant was not hers to make for anyone, but more changed than didn't. She knew this from Jonah, who walked more of the settlement's land than she did, and who reported with a matter-of-factness that had replaced his earlier anxiety. Caleb's Saturday walks had continued through the winter and into the spring, and by April they had expanded to include a wider range of the land than any single adult had been systematically documenting. He had a second notebook by then the first was filled, and the map had been redrawn twice on larger paper. He had also, in the quiet way of 11-year-olds who are pursuing something seriously, begun teaching the youngest children not just to identify plants but to document them, showing them his notation system and correcting their attempts with a patience that surprised adults who watched him, and that Elsie thought probably came from having been taught the same way. 12 in April, Nora Pierce made a small cake with ingredients that were partly from the settlement store and partly from what Elsie had shown her to dry and preserve, and the family ate it together, and the next morning Caleb was back at the creek with his notebook at the same time he always came. County Agricultural Society's spring gathering was in May. Elsie and Jonah made the journey by wagon over 2 days, which was uncomfortable, and at times interesting in the way that long wagon trips are interesting, the landscape changing, the land itself different in ways she cataloged automatically, plants along the road noting themselves in her mind as she passed. She had prepared what she was going to say. Not a speech in the formal sense, she had no talent for formal speeches, and no interest in pretending otherwise, but a sequence of things she knew, organized in the way she'd organize a session, with the particular logic of someone who had spent years learning how to make unfamiliar knowledge accessible without making it simple. The gathering was in the county seat, in a room that held about 60 people, and that smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco, and the particular mustiness of a building that was used for important occasions and otherwise mostly closed. The men who attended were farmers and agricultural officials, and a few people whose connection to farming was more administrative than physical, and they were, as a group, what she had expected competent people with fixed ideas, some of whom would hear her, and some of whom would be polite without hearing her, which was fine, which was how it always was. Edmund Ferris, the secretary who had written the letter, was a shorter man than his precise handwriting had suggested, with an expression of genuine interest that she had learned to distinguish from performed interest. He shook her hand and said something brief and appropriate, and did not, notably, treat her like someone who needed to be managed. She stood up when it was her turn. She looked at the room. Jonah was at the back, which was where she'd asked him to sit, because she needed to not be managing how he was receiving it while she was doing it. She started with the beetles. Not with the science, not with the plant catalog, not with herself. She started with the morning. The swarm arrived, and what the sky looked like, and the sound it made, and what it felt like to stand at a window watching everything a community had grown disappear in a few hours. She started there because that was the truth of it, and she had learned that truth landed differently than argument. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the years at the creek, and what she'd been learning and why. She talked about the journals, and what systematic documentation looked like and what it gave you. She talked about the months of teaching in the kitchen and the complications and the letters and the opposition, not with self-pity, but as honest components of what the work had actually required. Talked about Caleb and his map and what it meant that an 11-year-old had done something no adult in the settlement had done. She talked about Walt and his wife's knowledge and what it meant that that knowledge had almost been lost and what it meant that it hadn't been. She said near the end, the thing that Mabel had put into words for her in December, and that she had been turning over since then, that the land does not withhold what it has. It simply requires attention. It requires someone willing to look carefully at what is actually there, rather than what they expected or hoped or assumed to find, and that the problem is rarely the land's generosity. It is almost always the limits of our looking. The room was quiet when she finished. Ferris thanked her. Several men asked questions. Some of the questions were good, and she answered them fully. One question was condescending in the particular way of a man who has decided before you speak that he already knows more than you, and she answered it directly and without heat and moved on, because she had Jonah at the back of the room, and she was not going to give that question more weight than it deserved by responding to what was under it. Afterward, 3 men came to talk to her separately. 2 of them were from settlements in the eastern part of the county, and they asked, specifically and practically, whether she would be willing to correspond with someone from each settlement who was interested in beginning similar documentation. She said yes. She gave them the address of Ash Creek and told them to write in the fall, after the planting season was done, and she would answer what she could. The 3rd man was older and said very little. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than the others, and then said, "My wife has been doing this for 20 years, on our property. Nobody ever asked her about it. He paused. I should have. She looked at him. Tell her someone asked, she said, and tell her to write it down. He nodded and walked away, and she watched him go and thought about all the Walt's wives. There must be all the knowledge carried in the hands and minds of people who had never been invited to speak it into a room that was listening, and how much of it was already gone, and how much was still there waiting for someone to ask. They drove home over 2 days, the same road in reverse, the Mayland Green in a way it hadn't been going out. Jonah drove and she sat beside him, and they talked more than they usually talked on drives, which was itself something new or not new, but reclaimed, kind of talking that had been part of the early years of their marriage, and that had been crowded out by the years of strain, around what people thought and what it cost. He told her that she'd been good. He said it with the same matter-of-fact directness he'd used when he told her the nettle soup was good, which was the highest kind of compliment he had, not performance, just truth. Some of them will do something with it, she said. Some, he agreed. That's enough. Is it? She thought about this honestly. It has to be, she said. You can't make people pay attention to what you think is important. You can show them. You can make it as visible and as clear and as available as you know how to make it. And then it's their decision. She looked at the road ahead. The ones who decide to look, they'll find what's there. The ones who don't, she was quiet for a moment. The land will still be there when they need it. That's what I keep coming back to. The land doesn't give up on people just because they haven't been paying attention. Just keeps growing. Jonah was quiet for a while. Then he said, your grandmother told you that. Something like it, yes. She sounds like she was difficult, he said. Elsie looked at him sideways. She was, she said. Completely. I think you would have made her proud, he said. She looked at the road and didn't say anything for a long moment. The land moved past them, spring green and specific, this grass, that ridge, this rock formation she had noted on the way out and noted again now. A plan along the fence row that she couldn't identify from the wagon and filed as something to look up. Maybe, she said finally. Or she would have told me what I did wrong. Both, Jonah said. Both, she agreed. She was back at the creek the morning after they returned. This was not a statement or a decision so much as a return to the basic fact of her life. The creek was where she worked, had always worked. 2 days in a wagon and 40 minutes, speaking in a room in the county seat, did not change the fundamental arithmetic of it. There was still documentation to do. There were plants coming up in the spring that she was tracking week by week. There were entries from the winter that she wanted to cross-reference against what she was seeing now that the ground was soft. She went before the light was fully up, which was her way, and she had been there perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the sound of other people arriving at the bank. She looked up. Caleb was there with 3 of the children from his Saturday group. Rosie was there, a little apart from the others, crouching over something she'd found near the ice margin at the water's edge. A woman Elsie half recognized from the February walk was standing at the near bank, not crouching, but watching the water with the specific attention of someone who has learned something and is beginning to see differently because of it. None of them had seen her yet. They were doing what they came to do, looking at the land, writing things down, asking each other questions about what they found. Caleb was showing something to the youngest child, a boy of maybe 8 who was leaning in with his whole body the way children lean when something has caught them entirely. Elsie watched for a moment. She thought about what she had said in that room in the county seat, about the land not withholding what it has. She thought about the years before the beetles came, when she had walked this same bank alone, before dawn, with no company but the notebook and the cold, and the recurring awareness that nobody thought what she was doing was worth anything. She thought about how completely wrong that awareness had been. Not because the world was fair, or because the right thing always won, or because good work was always recognized. None of those things were consistently true, and she knew it. But because the knowledge had always been worth something, because the land had always been providing, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. The attention was the human part. The provision was older than people and would outlast them. She had not been wrong in those solitary mornings. She had been early, and now she was not solitary. She walked down the bank toward the group, and Caleb looked up and saw her coming, and his expression didn't change much. It never changed much, but there was a nod that had something in it. Specific recognition of someone who has been doing parallel work and is glad to not be doing it entirely alone. Found something, he said. Show me, she said. She crouched beside him in the mud, and he showed her, and she looked at it with the attention she had given everything in this creek bank for 4 years. And then she reached for the journal and wrote down the date and the location and what she was seeing, because this was what you did with the truth when you found it. You wrote it down, and you kept going, and you trusted that the work was more than the moment of doing it. Creek moved past them. The spring light was coming up over the east ridge, thin and clear. Somewhere down the bank, Rosie had found what she was looking for and was already drawing it, her charcoal moving in the careful, deliberate lines of someone who has learned that the drawing is itself a form of understanding. It was not a perfect morning. Elsie's knees were cold from the mud, and one of the younger children was asking a question that didn't quite make sense yet, and Caleb was explaining it with more patience than he usually had, which meant he was working at it. The sixth journal was filling up, and she'd need to get another at the general store. And there were 2 families she still needed to follow up with about their spring stores. And somewhere in the county, there were men who had heard her speak and would do nothing with it, and others who would. None of that was resolved. Most of it was not going to be resolved, not into the kind of cleanness that stories are sometimes expected to have, and that lives almost never do. But this is what she had come to understand. In the years since she had crouched alone in creek mud, while people at the general store laughed about it, the work is not rewarded by being finished. It is rewarded by being real. You notice the thing that is actually there, not the thing you hoped for or expected. You document it honestly, including the failures. You teach what you know to whoever will receive it, without requiring them to receive it in any particular way. You keep going when the opposition is loud, not because you're fearless. She had been afraid often, in ways that would have surprised the people who later called her brave, but because the alternative is to let the fear decide what happens next. And when the knowledge finally becomes larger than you, when it lives in other hands and other notebooks and other mornings on other creek banks, that you'll never walk, you recognize this not as loss, but as the whole point. This was what the land had been trying to tell anyone who would listen. In all the years it had been growing things in the fence rows and the creek margins and the waste ground, while people walked past without seeing. It had always been providing. They just had to learn how to pay attention. Elsie Hartwell had not been the strongest woman in Ash Creek, or the most admired, or the one anyone would have chosen to carry the hardest season. She had been the one who noticed what was there. She had been the one who wrote it down. She had been the one who kept coming back to the creek, through the cold and the mockery and the letters and the fear, because the creek had something to offer, and she was not willing to stop looking. And on this particular spring morning, crouching in the mud with a boy who had mapped more land than most men twice his age, with a girl 30 feet down the bank who was teaching herself to draw the world accurately, with the journal open to a new page, and the creek moving past the way it always moved, patient, continuous, indifferent to whether anyone was paying attention, she was simply a woman doing the work she had always done. It was, she thought, enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed the world to catch up to what she already knew.